Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep, where we explore the mysteries that unfold in the quiet hours when most of the world is at rest. I'm curious to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. As we begin this journey, together into the shadowy realm of unexplained events and forgotten crimes, the autumn of 1987 brought an unusual stillness to the small town of Millbrook. Nestled in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, where the changing leaves painted the landscape in deep amber and crimson hues that seemed to absorb the very sounds of daily life, creating an atmosphere of hushed expectancy that would prove to be the perfect backdrop for the strange events that were about to unfold in this seemingly ordinary community of 3,000 souls who went about their daily routines without any inkling that their peaceful existence was about to be disrupted by a series of mysterious occurrences that would leave lasting questions in their wake. Margaret Henley had lived in the same white colonial house on Maple Street for 37 years. Ever since she and her late husband Robert had purchased it as newlyweds fresh from their honeymoon in Niagara Falls. And in all those decades, she had never experienced anything quite like the peculiar sensations that began manifesting in the early morning hours of October 15th, when she first noticed the subtle but unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom door. Soft and deliberate movements that seemed to occur precisely at 3:17 each morning, lasting for exactly 4 minutes, before fading into the profound silence that characterized the pre-dawn hours in their quiet neighborhood. Was not a woman prone to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs, having spent 42 years as a practical and efficient librarian at the town's modest public library, where she had earned a reputation for her methodical approach to cataloging and her gentle but firm manner with patrons who attempted to return books past their due dates. So when these nocturnal disturbances began occurring with clockwork regularity, she approached the situation with the same systematic methodology she had applied to organizing the library's extensive collection of local history and genealogical records. The footsteps possessed a distinctive quality that Margaret found herself analyzing during the long hours she lay awake waiting for their inevitable arrival, noting that they seemed to belong to someone wearing soft-soled shoes, perhaps slippers or moccasins. And the gait suggested a person of medium build who moved with purposeful intent rather than the random wandering one might expect from a sleepwalker or confused intruder. And this observation led Margaret to begin keeping a detailed log in a small notebook she kept on her nightstand, recording not only the precise timing of each occurrence, but also subtle variations in the rhythm and duration of the mysterious PERAMBULATIONS. As October progressed, and the nights grew longer and colder, bringing with them the crisp scent of wood smoke from neighbors' fireplaces and the occasional rustle of dried leaves skittering across empty sidewalks, Margaret's mysterious visitor continued their nocturnal routine with unwavering punctuality, never arriving earlier or later than 3:17, never extending their stay beyond exactly 4 minutes, and never deviating from what appeared to be a specific route that began at the top of the stairs, proceeded down the hallway past the guest bedroom and bathroom, paused briefly outside Margaret's door, then continued to the end of the hall where Robert's old study remained exactly as he had left it when he passed away 3 years earlier. The study had become something of a shrine to Robert's memory, containing his collection of antique maps, his meticulously maintained stamp albums, and dozens of leather-bound journals filled with his careful observations about local wildlife and weather patterns, documentation that reflected his lifelong fascination with the natural world and his belief that careful observation could reveal patterns and connections that might otherwise go unnoticed by less attentive individuals. A philosophy that Margaret now found herself applying to her own mysterious circumstances as she attempted to discern some meaning or purpose behind these enigmatic nocturnal visits. On the night of October 28th, as a gentle rain began to fall, creating a soothing percussion against the windows and adding another layer of ambient sound to the house's natural acoustics. Margaret made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her investigation into these strange occurrences, choosing to leave her bedroom and position herself at the top of the stairs to observe directly whatever or whoever was responsible for the mysterious footsteps that had become such a regular feature of her sleeping hours. The house seemed to hold its breath as Margaret settled into the antique rocking chair that had belonged to her grandmother. Wrapping herself in the soft wool blanket Robert had brought back from their trip to Scotland in 1978, and as the digital clock on the hallway table approached 3:17, she felt her pulse quicken with anticipation and a subtle undercurrent of apprehension that she had not expected to experience in her own home, a place that had always represented safety and comfort throughout the many phases of her life. At precisely 3:17, the footsteps began, but now that Margaret was positioned to observe rather than merely listen, she discovered something that sent a chill through her entire being and caused her to grip the arms of the rocking chair with trembling fingers. For the sounds were there, exactly as they had been every night for the past 2 weeks, clear and distinct and undeniably real. But there was no visible presence to account for them, no shadowy figure moving through the hallway, no disturbance of the dust motes that danced in the pale moonlight streaming through the tall windows, nothing whatsoever to explain the steady, purposeful rhythm of footsteps that continued their familiar route as if the invisible walker was completely unaware of Margaret's presence. The experience left Margaret profoundly shaken, not because she believed in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but because the evidence of her own senses seemed to be contradicting the logical framework within which she had always understood the world to operate. And as she returned to her bedroom on unsteady legs, she found herself questioning not only the nature of what she had witnessed, but also her own perceptual reliability and mental state, concerns that kept her awake long after the mysterious footsteps had completed their nocturnal journey and faded into the encompassing silence. In the days that followed, Margaret found herself struggling with whether to confide in anyone about her strange experiences, acutely aware that such a confession might lead others to question her competence and emotional stability, particularly given her recent widowhood and the isolation that had become an increasingly prominent feature of her daily existence since Robert's passing. Yet the burden of carrying this knowledge alone was beginning to affect her concentration at work and her ability to maintain the cheerful demeanor that her library patrons had come to expect from their interactions with her. The solution to Margaret's dilemma came from an unexpected source when Dr. Patricia Summers, a recently retired professor of anthropology from the nearby State University, approached the reference desk with an inquiry about local folklore and historical accounts of unusual phenomena in the region, explaining that she was conducting research for a book about the intersection of community memory and unexplained experiences, a project that had grown out of her academic interest in how small towns process and preserve stories that fall outside conventional explanations. Dr. Summers possessed the kind of calm, scholarly demeanor that immediately put people at ease. With silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that suggested both wisdom and compassion. And when Margaret tentatively broached the subject of her own recent experiences, she found herself speaking to someone who listened without judgment and asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity rather than skepticism or concern about Margaret's mental state. The conversation that ensued over the following hour revealed that Dr. Summers had encountered numerous similar accounts during her research, stories told by otherwise rational individuals who had experienced phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality. And she explained that such experiences were far more common than most people realized, often going unreported due to the social stigma associated with claims that cannot be easily verified or explained through conventional means. Dr. Summers proposed a collaborative approach to investigating Margaret's situation, suggesting that they document the phenomena using both traditional observation methods and some of the recording equipment she had used in her anthropological fieldwork, an approach that would allow them to gather objective data while also exploring the historical and cultural context that might shed light on the mysterious occurrences. And Margaret found herself agreeing to this partnership with a sense of relief. That came from finally having someone who took her experiences seriously. The investigation began in earnest on the 1st of November, with Dr. Summers arriving at Margaret's house each evening at midnight and setting up unobtrusive recording devices in strategic locations throughout the hallway, equipment that was designed to detect even the slightest variations in temperature, electromagnetic fields, and acoustic properties that might provide clues about the nature of the phenomena they were attempting to study, while Margaret continued to maintain her detailed log of times, durations, and any notable variations in the pattern of the mysterious footsteps. On their third night of monitoring, the equipment detected several anomalies that coincided precisely with the audible footsteps, including a drop in temperature of exactly 3 degrees along the path the invisible walker appeared to take, and a brief but distinct electromagnetic disturbance that registered on the sensitive instruments Dr. Summers had borrowed from the university's physics department. Readings that provided objective confirmation that something genuine was occurring, even though its nature remained mysterious and unexplained. The breakthrough in their investigation came not from the sophisticated monitoring equipment, but from Margaret's careful examination of Robert's journals, which she had been reluctant to disturb in the months following his death, but now felt compelled to review, in search of any references to unusual phenomena or experiences that might be connected to their current situation. And as she methodically worked through volume after volume of his meticulous observations about everything from seasonal migration patterns to unusual weather formations, she discovered a series of entries from the autumn of 1984 that described experiences remarkably similar to her own current circumstances. According to Robert's detailed notes, he had been awakened on multiple occasions during October of that year by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, experiences that he had initially attributed to the house settling or perhaps mice in the walls, but which had continued with such regularity and distinctiveness that he had eventually been forced to acknowledge that he was dealing with something that defied conventional explanation, and his subsequent investigation had revealed a pattern of similar reports from other residents of Maple Street dating back several decades. Robert's research, conducted with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to all his interests, had uncovered historical accounts of mysterious footsteps in houses throughout the neighborhood, stories that had been passed down through families but rarely discussed openly due to the social awkwardness associated with such claims. And his interviews with elderly residents had revealed a pattern of experiences that seemed to occur primarily during the autumn months, and particularly in houses that had been built on land that had once been part of a much larger estate belonging to a prominent local family in the late 19th century. The estate had belonged to the Whitmore family, prosperous merchants who had made their fortune in the lumber trade during the boom years following the Civil War. And the grand Victorian mansion that had once stood where Margaret's house now occupied a small portion of the original grounds had been the site of a tragic fire in November of 1891 that had claimed the lives of 3 members of the family, including the elderly patriarch Samuel Whitmore, who had been known throughout the community for his habit of taking long walks through the house during the early morning hours as a remedy for the insomnia that had plagued him in his later years. The fire had occurred under circumstances that were never fully explained, with investigators of the time noting several inconsistencies in witness accounts and evidence that suggested the blaze had started simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the house, a pattern that was difficult to reconcile with accidental causes but which could not be definitively attributed to arson due to the limited forensic capabilities available in that era. And the case had eventually been classified as undetermined origin. A conclusion that had satisfied no one, but which had allowed the insurance companies to settle the claims and the community to move forward from the tragedy. Samuel Whitmore had been discovered in the hallway outside his bedroom, apparently overcome by smoke while attempting to evacuate the house. And according to the newspaper accounts that Robert had meticulously copied into his research files, several witnesses had reported seeing a figure moving through the smoke-filled corridors of the burning mansion, seemingly searching for something or someone, an image that had haunted the community's collective memory and contributed to the various ghost stories and unexplained phenomena that had been reported in the area. Ever since Dr. Summers found Robert's research fascinating from both historical and anthropological perspectives, particularly his documentation of how the community had processed and preserved these experiences across multiple generations, creating an informal network of shared knowledge that existed alongside but separate from official records and mainstream narratives. And she suggested that Margaret's current experiences might represent a continuation of this long-standing pattern rather than an isolated occurrence. The theory that emerged from their collaborative analysis was that certain environmental conditions, possibly related to seasonal changes in temperature and humidity, might be creating acoustic properties that amplified or replicated sounds from the past, a phenomenon that could explain both the consistency of the timing and the specific route taken by the mysterious footsteps, while also accounting for the electromagnetic and temperature anomalies detected by their monitoring equipment. Asterisk. The scientific approach to explaining the unexplained provided Margaret with a framework for understanding her experiences that did not require her to abandon her rational worldview or accept supernatural explanations. And as November progressed and the mysterious footsteps continued their nightly routine, she found herself able to coexist peacefully with the phenomena, even developing a sense of companionship with the invisible presence that had initially caused her such distress. The investigation might have concluded at this point, with Margaret satisfied to have found both an explanation and a community of understanding through her collaboration with Dr. Summers. But on the night of November 15th, exactly 1 month after the footsteps had first begun, something occurred that would add a new dimension to the mystery and challenge all the theories they had so carefully constructed to explain the phenomena. Margaret was awakened not by footsteps, but by the distinct sound of papers rustling, coming from the direction of Robert's study at the far end of the hallway. And when she checked the digital clock on her nightstand, she saw that it was 3:21, 4 minutes after the usual conclusion of the nightly perambulation, a timing that suggested a connection to the established pattern, while introducing a new element that demanded investigation. Moving quietly through the house with a flashlight to avoid disturbing any potential phenomena with the harsh illumination of electric lights, Margaret made her way to the study, where she discovered that several of Robert's journals had been removed from their usual places on the bookshelf and arranged on his desk in a specific pattern that seemed deliberately organized rather than randomly disturbed, with the volumes containing his research into the mysterious footsteps positioned prominently in the center of the arrangement. The implications of this discovery were profound and unsettling, suggesting that whatever force was responsible for the nightly footsteps was also capable of physical manipulation of objects and possessed some form of intelligence or intentionality that went beyond the simple repetition of an established route. And Margaret found herself facing questions about the nature of consciousness and identity that challenged her most fundamental assumptions about existence and reality. When Dr. Summers arrived the following evening to continue their monitoring, she examined the arrangement of journals with the methodical approach of a trained researcher, photographing their positions and noting the specific volumes that had been selected, and their relationship to Robert's investigation into the historical phenomena. And her analysis revealed a pattern that seemed to be directing attention to the particular aspects of the Whitmore family tragedy that Robert had not fully explored in his research. Asterisk. The selected journals contained references to Samuel Whitmore's personal papers, which had survived the fire and been donated to the local historical society by surviving family members. Documents that Robert had mentioned in his notes, but had not examined in detail due to restrictions on access to the collection. Limitations that Dr. Summers was able to overcome through her academic credentials and professional connections with the Historical Society's Board of Directors. The Whitmore papers, housed in carefully preserved archival boxes in the climate-controlled basement of the Historical Society's building, contained a treasure trove of personal correspondence, business records, and most importantly for their investigation, Samuel Whitmore's private diary, which provided intimate details about his life in the months leading up to the tragic fire that had claimed his life and destroyed his family's ancestral home. Samuel's diary entries from the autumn of 1891 revealed a man struggling with insomnia and anxiety about financial difficulties that threatened to destroy the family's business empire. Problems that had driven him to take increasingly longer walks through the house during the early morning hours. A habit that his concerned family members had noted with growing alarm as his behavior became more erratic and obsessive in the weeks before his death. More significantly for Margaret and Dr. Summers' investigation, the diary contained detailed descriptions of strange phenomena that Samuel had begun experiencing in the house, including unexplained sounds, cold spots, and what he described as the sensation of being observed by an unseen presence. Experiences that had contributed to his insomnia and compelled him to conduct his own investigation into the history of the land on which his mansion had been built. Samuel's research had uncovered disturbing information about the property's previous owners, including accounts of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths that stretched back to the area's earliest colonial settlements, suggesting that the land itself might be somehow connected to the various strange phenomena that had been reported there over the centuries. A possibility that Samuel had begun to explore through correspondence with experts in what would today be called paranormal research, but which, in his era, was considered a legitimate field of scientific inquiry. The most revealing entries in Samuel's diary described his growing conviction that the mysterious phenomena in his house were connected to the presence of someone or something that had remained attached to the property long after their physical death, a presence that Samuel believed was attempting to communicate important information about events that had occurred on the land in the distant past. And his final entries suggested that he was on the verge of a significant discovery. When the fire interrupted his investigation, the parallels between Samuel Whitmore's experiences in 1891 and Margaret's current situation were striking and undeniable. From the timing of the phenomena to the specific route taken by the mysterious footsteps, and Dr. Summers suggested that they might be dealing with what anthropologists call a place memory, a theoretical phenomenon in which traumatic or significant events become somehow imprinted on a location and continue to manifest under certain environmental conditions. This hypothesis provided a framework for understanding both the historical continuity of the phenomena and their apparent intelligence or intentionality, suggesting that what Margaret and others had interpreted as a ghostly presence might actually be a form of psychic recording that contained information about past events and was somehow being triggered by contemporary circumstances that paralleled the original conditions under which the recording was created. The practical implications of this theory were both comforting and disturbing, offering an explanation for the phenomena that did not require belief in supernatural entities, while simultaneously suggesting that the mysterious occurrences might contain important information about historical events that had been lost or suppressed over the decades since the original tragedy. Information that might explain not only the current manifestations but also the various unexplained deaths and disappearances that had occurred on the property throughout its history. As December approached and the first snow began to dust the streets of Millbrook, Margaret found herself settling into a routine that incorporated the nightly footsteps as a natural part of her domestic environment. no longer experiencing fear or anxiety when 317 arrived, but instead feeling a sense of anticipation and even companionship as the invisible presence made its familiar journey through the hallway outside her bedroom. Dr. Summers continued her research into the historical context of the phenomena, uncovering additional accounts of similar experiences in other locations where tragic events had occurred, building a database of cases that supported their theoretical framework, while also revealing patterns that suggested certain types of traumatic events were more likely to create lasting impressions than others, with sudden or unexpected deaths appearing to generate the strongest and most persistent manifestations. The collaboration between Margaret and Dr. Summers had evolved into something more than a simple investigation, becoming a friendship based on shared curiosity and mutual respect for the mysteries that exist at the margins of human understanding. And their weekly meetings to review evidence and discuss theories had become a highlight of Margaret's social calendar, providing her with intellectual stimulation and emotional support that had been missing from her life since Robert's death. On the night of December 21st, the winter solstice, Margaret experienced something that would add yet another layer to the mystery and suggest new directions for their ongoing investigation. For instead of the familiar footsteps beginning at precisely 3:17, she was awakened at 3:15 by what sounded distinctly like a voice calling her name, not loudly or urgently, but with a gentle insistence that seemed to be requesting her attention rather than demanding it. The voice was neither clearly masculine nor feminine, but possessed a quality that suggested great age and weariness, as if the speaker had been carrying a heavy burden for far longer than any living person could endure. And there was something in its tone that conveyed both sorrow and hope, as if the act of speaking her name represented a breakthrough in a long and frustrating attempt to communicate something of vital importance. Margaret found herself responding instinctively to the summons, leaving her bedroom and walking slowly down the hallway toward the study, guided not by any visible presence, but by an intuitive understanding of where she needed to go. And when she reached Robert's desk, she discovered that one of Samuel Whitmore's diary entries had been bookmarked with a pressed flower that she had never seen before. A delicate violet that appeared to be perfectly preserved, despite what must have been decades or even centuries of age. The bookmarked entry described Samuel's discovery of a hidden compartment in the basement of his mansion, a secret space that had contained documents and artifacts related to the original colonial settlement of the area, items that had apparently been concealed by previous owners, who had wanted to suppress information about events that had occurred on the property in its earliest days. Information that Samuel had believed was connected to the mysterious phenomena he had been experiencing. According to his diary, Samuel had been in the process of cataloging these hidden documents when the fire had erupted, and he had been attempting to rescue the most important papers from the basement when he had been overcome by smoke. A detail that explained both his presence in the hallway where his body had been found and his apparent disorientation during the evacuation, suggesting that his death had been the result of his determination to preserve historical information, rather than simple panic or confusion. The pressed violet that had marked this particular entry was significant because Samuel had mentioned in earlier diary entries that such flowers had been found throughout the hidden compartment, pressed between the pages of old documents as if someone had been using them as bookmarks or preservation aids. A detail that suggested the flower had somehow been transported from the secret basement of the original mansion to Robert's desk in Margaret's house. A journey that defied conventional explanations, but which seemed consistent with the other unexplained phenomena they had been investigating. Dr. Summers was fascinated by this latest development, particularly the apparent intelligence behind the selection of the specific diary entry and the symbolic significance of the violet, which she identified as a species that had been commonly used in colonial times for both medicinal and spiritual purposes, often associated with communication between the living and the dead in various folk traditions that had been practiced by early Settlers in the region thought the implications of this discovery suggested that the mysterious presence was not simply repeating past actions but was actively attempting to guide contemporary investigators toward information that had been lost or suppressed, using whatever means available to communicate across the boundaries that normally separate past and present, physical and non-physical existence, and the living from the dead. This realization transformed Margaret's understanding of her situation from a passive experience of unexplained phenomena to an active collaboration with an intelligence that possessed knowledge about historical events, and was attempting to share that knowledge with someone who had the capability and resources to act upon it, a role that Margaret found both thrilling and intimidating as she contemplated the responsibilities that might come with such a partnership. Asterisk. The winter months that followed were filled with intensive research as Margaret and Dr. Summers worked to locate and examine any surviving records that might provide clues about the contents of Samuel Whitmore's secret basement and the historical events that had apparently been documented in the hidden papers that had been lost in the fire, a search that led them through dusty archives, forgotten genealogical records, and obscure historical accounts that painted a picture of the early colonial period that was far more complex and troubling than the sanitized versions typically found in local history books. Their investigation revealed a pattern of unexplained disappearances and mysterious deaths among the earliest settlers in the area, events that had been attributed to various causes ranging from Indian attacks to wild animal encounters to simple accidents, but which when examined collectively suggested the possibility of more sinister explanations that the colonial authorities had either been unable to investigate properly or had chosen to suppress for reasons of community stability and safety. The most significant discovery came when Dr. Summers located a collection of letters in the state archives that had been written by a colonial minister who had served the area's early settlements, correspondence that contained detailed accounts of what he described as unnatural events and malevolent influences that had plagued the community from its earliest days, phenomena that he had attributed to the presence of evil spirits or demonic entities that had been drawn to the area by some unknown factor. The minister's letters described attempted exorcisms and purification rituals that had been conducted at various locations throughout the area, including the site where Samuel Whitmore's mansion would later be built, ceremonies that had apparently been successful in reducing but not entirely eliminating the mysterious phenomena, and his correspondence suggested that important information about these events had been deliberately concealed by community leaders who feared that knowledge of supernatural threats would prevent new settlers from moving to the area. This historical context provided a framework for understanding both the phenomena that Margaret had been experiencing and the apparent urgency with which the mysterious presence was attempting to communicate information about past events, suggesting that the current manifestations might represent an attempt by Samuel Whitmore's spirit to complete the investigation that had been interrupted by his death in the fire, using contemporary investigators as tools to uncover and preserve historical truth that had been suppressed for centuries. The responsibility of this role weighed heavily on Margaret, who found herself wondering whether she was equipped to handle knowledge that previous generations had considered too dangerous to preserve, but her collaboration with Dr. Summers provided her with both the scholarly resources and emotional support necessary to continue the investigation, and their partnership had evolved into a friendship that enriched both their lives, while allowing them to pursue answers to questions that neither could have addressed alone. As spring arrived in Millbrook and the mysterious footsteps continued their nightly routine with unwavering consistency, Margaret had become accustomed to her role as a conduit between past and present, accepting the strange phenomena as part of her daily existence while remaining committed to the ongoing investigation that had given new purpose and meaning to her life in the years following Robert's death. Dr. Summers had begun incorporating their discoveries into her research for the book about community memory and unexplained phenomena, using Margaret's case as a central example of how individuals can become inadvertent participants in historical processes that extend far beyond their personal experience. And their collaboration had attracted the attention of other researchers who were studying similar phenomena in different locations, creating a network of investigators who shared information and supported each other's work. The morning of April 30th brought an unexpected development when Margaret discovered that the pressed violet that had appeared on Robert's desk during the winter solstice had been joined by a small collection of other botanical specimens, each one marking a different passage in Samuel Whitmore's diary, creating what appeared to be a deliberate selection of entries that told a coherent story about his investigation into the property's mysterious history. The selected passages described Samuel's growing understanding of the forces that had influenced events on the land throughout its history, his discovery of evidence suggesting that the area had been the site of significant spiritual or supernatural activity long before European settlement, and his conviction that the various tragedies that had occurred there were connected by something more than mere coincidence, a pattern of malevolent influence that he had been attempting to document. When the fire had cut short his life and his research, Dr. Summers' analysis of these carefully curated diary entries revealed what appeared to be a systematic attempt to provide contemporary investigators with the information necessary to understand and potentially address the underlying causes of the phenomena that had plagued the area for centuries. A possibility that suggested the mysterious presence was not simply sharing historical knowledge, but was actively seeking help in resolving issues that had remained unaddressed since Samuel's death in 1891. This realization added a new dimension to their investigation, transforming it from a study of unexplained phenomena into what might be considered a rescue mission, an attempt to provide assistance to an intelligence that had been trapped between worlds for more than a century, unable to rest until the important work that had been interrupted by tragedy could finally be completed with the help of living collaborators who possessed the resources and knowledge necessary to succeed where Samuel had failed. The summer months brought intensive research as Margaret and Dr. Summers worked to decode the messages they believed were being communicated through the selection of diary entries and the symbolic significance of the botanical specimens, a process that required not only careful analysis of historical documents, but also an understanding of the spiritual and folk traditions that had influenced colonial settlers' interpretations of supernatural phenomena. Their investigation led them to examine archaeological evidence from the earliest periods of human habitation in the area, research that revealed the presence of Native American sacred sites that had been documented by colonial surveyors, but which had been largely forgotten as European settlement expanded and indigenous peoples were displaced from their traditional territories, locations that seemed to correlate with reports of mysterious phenomena in ways that suggested possible connections between ancient spiritual practices and contemporary unexplained events. The most significant breakthrough came when Dr. Summers discovered references to a particular Native American burial ground that had been located on the exact site where Samuel Whitmore's mansion had later been built, a sacred space that had been disturbed by construction activities in the late 1800s, potentially creating the spiritual imbalance that Samuel had been attempting to understand and address through his research into the property's troubled history. This discovery suggested that the phenomena Margaret had been experiencing might be related not only to Samuel Whitmore's unfinished investigation, but also to much older spiritual disturbances that had been affecting the area for generations, influences that had manifested in various ways throughout the centuries, but which had remained largely unrecognized because of cultural barriers between European and Native American approaches to understanding supernatural phenomena. The implications of this realization were both profound and practical, suggesting that resolution of the ongoing phenomena might require not just historical documentation, but also spiritual healing practices that acknowledged and addressed the cultural and spiritual dimensions of the disturbances that had been affecting the area for so many generations. Work that would require the collaboration of individuals who understood both academic research methods and traditional spiritual practices. As autumn returned to Millbrook and the anniversary of Margaret's first encounter with the mysterious footsteps approached, she found herself reflecting on the year of investigation and discovery that had transformed her understanding of reality, and her role in the ongoing story of her community's hidden history. Changes that had brought both challenges and rewards that she could never have anticipated when she first heard those soft footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom door. The nightly visits had continued without interruption throughout the entire year, maintaining their precise timing and familiar route, while occasionally providing additional communications through the arrangement of objects in Robert's study, messages that had guided Margaret and Dr. Summers toward discoveries that might otherwise have remained buried in forgotten archives and overlooked historical records. Information that was gradually revealing the complex web of connections between past and present that existed beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary small town. Dr. Summers had completed her book manuscript, using their investigation as a central case study in her exploration of how communities process and preserve memories of events that challenge conventional understanding, and several publishers had expressed interest in the work, recognizing its potential contribution to emerging fields of study that examine the intersection of history, anthropology, and unexplained phenomena from academic perspectives that maintain scholarly rigor while remaining open to possibilities that had traditionally been dismissed by mainstream research. Margaret had begun corresponding with other individuals who had experienced similar phenomena, sharing her story with people from around the country who had found themselves unexpectedly involved in what appeared to be ongoing relationships with deceased persons who had unfinished business or important information to communicate. And these connections had provided her with a support network of people who understood the unique challenges and responsibilities that came with such experiences. The approaching anniversary of her first encounter with the mysterious footsteps filled Margaret with anticipation and uncertainty, wondering whether the date might bring some form of resolution to the phenomena that had become such an important part of her life, or whether October 15th would simply mark another milestone in an ongoing relationship that might continue for months or years to come, a possibility that she found both daunting and comforting as she considered the ways in which this strange partnership had enriched her existence. On the night of October 14th, Margaret prepared for what might be a significant evening by arranging flowers from her garden on Robert's desk, creating a welcoming environment for whatever communication might occur. And as she settled into bed to await the familiar 3:17 arrival of her invisible visitor, she found herself filled with gratitude for the unexpected adventure that had brought such meaning and purpose to what might otherwise have been a period of loneliness and decline following her husband's death. At precisely 3:17, the footsteps began their familiar journey, but as they approached Margaret's bedroom door, they paused for longer than usual, and in the extended silence that followed, Margaret heard her name spoken again. Not with the urgent insistence of the winter solstice communication, but with what sounded unmistakably like affection and gratitude, emotions that seemed to bridge the gap between physical and spiritual existence, and created a moment of connection that transcended the boundaries normally associated with death. The footsteps resumed and completed their usual route to the study, but when Margaret followed to see whether any new messages had been left, she discovered that the botanical specimens that had accumulated throughout the year had been arranged in a perfect circle around a single white rose that had not been there when she had checked the room earlier that evening, a flower that seemed to glow with its own inner light and filled the study with a fragrance that reminded Margaret of the garden she had shared with Robert during their many happy years together. Beside the white rose lay an envelope that bore Margaret's name in elegant handwriting that seemed somehow familiar, though she could not immediately place it. And when she opened it with trembling fingers, she found a letter written on paper that appeared to be very old, but was somehow perfectly preserved. Communication from Samuel Whitmore himself that expressed his profound gratitude for her assistance in completing the investigation that his death had interrupted, and provided final instructions for ensuring that the knowledge they had uncovered would be preserved for future generations. The letter explained that Samuel's spirit had remained attached to the property because of his deep sense of responsibility for protecting information about the spiritual disturbances that had affected the area throughout its history. Knowledge that he had believed was essential for preventing future tragedies, but which he had been unable to properly document or communicate before the fire had claimed his life, leaving him trapped between worlds until he could find someone willing and able to complete the work he had begun. Samuel's final message indicated that Margaret and Dr. Summers had succeeded in uncovering and preserving the historical information that had been lost in the fire, creating a permanent record of the area's troubled spiritual history that would be available to future researchers and community members who might need to understand and address similar phenomena, accomplishing the goal that had kept his spirit earthbound for more than a century. The letter concluded with Samuel's assurance that his presence would no longer be necessary now that the important work had been completed. Though he wanted Margaret to know that their collaboration had brought him peace, and that he would always be grateful for her willingness to serve as a bridge between past and present, helping to ensure that important knowledge would not be lost to the passage of time, and that the spiritual healing that had begun through their investigation could continue through the work of others who would build upon their discoveries. As Margaret finished reading the letter, she became aware that the atmosphere in the study had changed, feeling lighter and more peaceful than it had in all the months since the phenomena had begun, as if a great weight had been lifted not only from the room, but from the entire house. And she understood that Samuel Whitmore had finally found the rest that had eluded him for so many decades. His spirit released from the obligation that had bound him to the physical world through the completion of the mission that had cost him his life in 1891. The white rose continued to glow with its ethereal light for several more minutes before gradually fading to the normal appearance of a beautiful but otherwise ordinary flower. And as the supernatural radiance diminished, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion and satisfaction that came from knowing she had played a vital role in resolving a mystery that had persisted for more than a century, helping to heal wounds that had affected not only individual souls, but entire communities across multiple generations. In the days that followed, Margaret experienced the deep silence of nights without mysterious footsteps for the first time in exactly 1 year. And though she had thought she would welcome the return to normalcy, she found herself missing the sense of purpose and companionship that the nightly visits had provided, recognizing that her collaboration with Samuel Whitmore had filled a void in her life that she had not fully acknowledged until it was no longer there. Dr. Summers visited frequently during this period of adjustment, helping Margaret process the emotional impact of losing a relationship that had become so central to her daily existence. And together, they worked to organize and preserve all the documentation they had gathered during their year-long investigation, creating an archive that would serve as a resource for future researchers, while also honoring the memory of Samuel Whitmore and the other individuals whose stories had been uncovered through their collaborative efforts. The publication of Dr. Summers' book several months later brought national attention to their investigation and led to invitations for Margaret to speak at conferences and seminars about her experiences, opportunities that allowed her to share her story with other individuals who had encountered similar phenomena and to contribute to growing scholarly interest in the intersection between historical research and unexplained experiences, work that provided new meaning and direction for her retirement years. Margaret's house on Maple Street returned to the peaceful quiet that had characterized it before the autumn of 1987, but the year of mysterious footsteps had left lasting changes. in both the physical and spiritual atmosphere of the home, creating a sense of harmony and completion that had not existed even during her happiest years with Robert. As if the resolution of Samuel Whitmore's unfinished business had somehow healed wounds that had been affecting the property since the tragic fire that had claimed his life more than a century earlier. Asterisk. The Historical Society created a special exhibit based on the research that Margaret and Dr. Summers had conducted, displaying copies of Samuel Whitmore's diary entries alongside artifacts from the colonial period and contemporary. Photographs of locations where unexplained phenomena had been reported, educational materials that helped community members understand their area's complex spiritual history while also providing context for experiences that might otherwise have seemed frightening or incomprehensible. As the seasons cycled through their eternal rhythm and new residents moved into homes throughout the neighborhood, Margaret often found herself wondering whether other people were experiencing phenomena similar to what she had encountered, and she made herself available as a resource for anyone who might need guidance or support in dealing with unexplained experiences, recognizing that her unique knowledge and understanding carried with it a responsibility to help others who might find themselves thrust into similar situations without warning or preparation. The botanical specimens that had appeared throughout her investigation were carefully preserved between the pages of Robert's journals, creating a permanent record of the communications that had guided their research while also serving as tangible reminders of the extraordinary year when the boundaries between past and present had become permeable in ways that had transformed her understanding of existence itself. Changes that continued to influence her daily life, long after the mysterious footsteps had ceased their nightly journeys through the hallway outside her bedroom door. Years passed quietly in the small town of Millbrook, where the changing seasons brought their familiar rhythms of renewal and rest, and Margaret settled into a routine that balanced her ongoing correspondence with researchers and experiencers around the country with the simple pleasures of gardening, reading, and maintaining the peaceful home that had been the stage for such extraordinary events, finding contentment in the knowledge that she had played a meaningful role in preserving important historical information and helping a troubled spirit find the peace that had eluded him for so many decades. The story of Margaret Henley and her collaboration with Samuel Whitmore became part of the local folklore that was passed down through families and shared with newcomers who expressed curiosity about the area's history. But unlike the whispered tales of supernatural occurrences that had circulated in previous generations, this account was documented with scholarly precision and supported by physical evidence that could be examined and verified by anyone who was interested in learning about the complex web of connections that linked past and present in their seemingly ordinary community. Dr. Summers continued her research into similar phenomena in other locations, using the methodological framework she had developed during her collaboration with Margaret to investigate cases around the country where individuals had reported ongoing relationships with deceased persons who appeared to have important information to communicate. Work that gradually revealed patterns suggesting that such experiences were far more common than had previously been recognized, and that they often involved attempts by the dead to complete unfinished business or share knowledge that had been lost through tragic circumstances. The network of researchers and experiencers that had grown out of their initial investigation continued to expand over the years, creating a supportive community of individuals who understood the unique challenges and rewards that came with serving as bridges between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. And their collective work contributed to gradual changes in societal attitudes toward unexplained phenomena, fostering greater openness to possibilities that had traditionally been dismissed or ridiculed by mainstream culture. Margaret's correspondence files grew thick with letters from people around the world who had read Dr. Summers' book or heard about their investigation through other channels. Individuals who shared their own stories of mysterious experiences and sought advice about how to understand and respond to phenomena that challenged their assumptions about reality, and she found deep satisfaction in providing support and guidance to others who found themselves navigating the complex territory between skepticism and belief. The quiet hours of early morning, when the mysterious footsteps had once provided their regular companionship, became a time for meditation and reflection as Margaret processed the continuing impact of her extraordinary year and considered how the lessons she had learned about the persistence of love and responsibility beyond death might apply to her own eventual transition from physical to spiritual existence. Questions that no longer frightened her as they might have before. Her collaboration with Samuel Whitmore had shown her that death was not an ending but a transformation. The white rose that had appeared in Robert's study on the final night of the phenomena was carefully pressed and preserved between the pages of Samuel Whitmore's diary, where it remained as fresh and fragrant as it had been on the night it had materialized, as a symbol of completion and gratitude, a tangible reminder of the connection that had developed between two souls separated by more than a century, but united by their shared commitment to preserving truth and helping others understand the mysteries that exist at the margins of human experience. As Margaret entered her 70th year, she found herself increasingly interested in the spiritual dimensions of existence that her collaboration with Samuel Whitmore had revealed, pursuing studies in meditation and contemplative practices that helped her maintain the sense of connection with non-physical realms that had become such an important part of her understanding of reality. Preparations that she viewed as natural extensions of the work she had already begun in bridging the gap between visible and invisible worlds. The house on Maple Street continued to serve as a gathering place for researchers and others who were interested in learning about the intersection between historical investigation and unexplained phenomena, and Margaret welcomed visitors who came seeking information or guidance, finding that her home had become a kind of informal sanctuary for people who were grappling with experiences that challenged conventional understanding, a role that felt like a natural evolution of her collaboration with Samuel Whitmore and her commitment to helping others navigate the complex territory where past and present intersect. The seasonal cycles brought their familiar rhythms of change and renewal to the gardens that Margaret tended with loving care, creating spaces of beauty and tranquility that seemed to attract not only living creatures, but also the subtle presences that existed at the edges of perception, entities that Margaret had learned to acknowledge with gratitude rather than fear, understanding that the world contained far more intelligence and consciousness than most people recognized. Awareness that manifested in countless ways for those who had developed the sensitivity to perceive and appreciate such phenomena. Dr. Summers' subsequent books expanded on the theoretical framework they had developed together, incorporating cases from around the world and drawing connections between individual experiences and broader patterns of spiritual activity that suggested the existence of complex systems of communication and support that operated across the boundaries that normally separated different dimensions of existence. Research that contributed to emerging fields of study that examined consciousness and survival from scientific perspectives, while remaining open to possibilities that transcended materialist explanations. The historical society's exhibit about the Whitmore family and the mysterious phenomena associated with their property became one of the most popular displays in the museum, attracting visitors from around the region who were interested in learning about local history while also gaining insights into the kinds of unexplained experiences that had affected communities throughout the area for generations. Educational materials that helped normalize discussions about supernatural phenomena, while also providing historical context that made such experiences more understandable and less frightening. Margaret's speaking engagements at universities and conferences around the country provided opportunities to share her story with academic audiences who were increasingly interested in studying anomalous experiences from scholarly perspectives, and her presentations consistently emphasized The importance of approaching such phenomena with both open minds and rigorous methodological standards. Attitudes that could lead to discoveries that expanded human understanding, while also helping individuals who found themselves dealing with extraordinary circumstances. The network of correspondence that had developed through her public speaking and Dr. Summers' publications created connections with researchers and experiencers on multiple continents. Individuals who shared information about similar phenomena in different cultural contexts and contributed to growing international interest in systematic studies of consciousness and survival. Collaborative efforts that were gradually breaking down the barriers between scientific and spiritual approaches to understanding the nature of existence. As the anniversary of her first encounter with the mysterious footsteps approached each autumn, Margaret found herself reflecting on the profound changes that had occurred in her life since that October night when she had first heard the soft sounds of invisible movement in the hallway outside her bedroom. Transformations that had led not only to personal growth and new relationships, but also to contributions to human knowledge that she could never have imagined. When she had been living the quiet life of a small-town librarian with no expectation that her remaining years would be filled with such adventure and purpose. The preservation of Samuel Whitmore's story and the documentation of their collaborative investigation had created a permanent record that would be available to future generations of researchers and experiencers, ensuring that the knowledge they had uncovered would not be lost to the passage of time as it had been when the original mansion had been destroyed in the tragic fire of 1891. Accomplishment that provided Margaret with deep satisfaction and accomplishment that provided Margaret with deep satisfaction and a sense that her life had contributed something meaningful to the ongoing human effort to understand the mysteries of existence. The botanical specimens that continued to appear occasionally in Robert's study served as reminders that the boundaries between physical and spiritual realms remained permeable for those who had developed the sensitivity to perceive such phenomena. And Margaret had learned to interpret these gifts as expressions of gratitude from entities who appreciated her willingness to serve as a bridge between worlds, recognition that brought her continuing joy and reinforced her commitment to helping others who found themselves thrust into similar circumstances. The quiet hours of night in the house on Maple Street had returned to their natural silence, but the peace that now characterized those hours was deeper and more complete than it had ever been before the year of mysterious footsteps. As if the resolution of Samuel Whitmore's unfinished business had healed not only his troubled spirit, but also the spiritual atmosphere of the entire property, creating conditions that supported tranquility and contemplation rather than the restless energy that had characterized the location for more than a century. Dr. Summers' retirement from formal academic positions had allowed her to devote full attention to her research into anomalous phenomena, and her collaboration with Margaret had evolved into a lifelong partnership that combined scholarly rigor with personal friendship, creating a working relationship that served as a model for others who were attempting to study unexplained experiences, while maintaining both scientific standards and human compassion for the individuals whose lives had been affected by such phenomena. The community of Millbrook had gradually come to terms with the extraordinary events that had occurred in their midst, incorporating the story of Margaret and Samuel Whitmore into their collective understanding of local history, while also developing greater openness to the possibility that their seemingly ordinary town might harbor other mysteries waiting to be discovered by residents who possessed the curiosity and courage to investigate unusual experiences rather than dismissing them as imagination or delusion. As Margaret approached the final decades of her life, she found herself increasingly focused on preparing for her own eventual transition from physical to spiritual existence, viewing death not as an ending to be feared, but as a transformation that would allow her to continue the work of helping others understand the connections that existed between different dimensions of reality, preparation that felt like a natural extension of everything she had learned during her collaboration. With Samuel Whitmore and her subsequent years of research and service to others who had encountered similar phenomena, the legacy of their investigation extended far beyond the immediate resolution of the mysterious footsteps that had first brought them together, contributing to broader changes in how society approached questions about consciousness, survival, and the nature of reality itself. Transformations that were gradually making it easier for individuals to report and study unusual experiences without fear of ridicule or professional consequences. Progress that would benefit countless future researchers and experiencers who would build upon the foundations that pioneers like Margaret and Dr. Summers had established through their careful and compassionate work. The house on Maple Street remained a place of peace and healing where the past and present coexisted in harmony, and Margaret continued to welcome visitors who came seeking information or guidance about unexplained phenomena, finding that her role as an elder and teacher in this emerging field provided continuing purpose and satisfaction as she shared the wisdom she had gained through her extraordinary collaboration with the spirit who had been waiting more than a century to complete his important work. The seasonal rhythms of life in small-town Pennsylvania provided a comforting backdrop for Margaret's continuing correspondence and research. And as each autumn brought the anniversary of her first encounter with the mysterious footsteps, she found herself filled with gratitude for the unexpected adventure that had transformed her later years from a period of quiet decline into a time of discovery, growth, and service that had enriched not only her own life, but also the lives of countless others who had been touched by her story and her willingness to share what she had learned. The preservation of historical truth and the healing of ancient wounds had proven to be work that transcended the boundaries between life and death, creating connections that would continue to influence future generations long after Margaret herself had made the transition from physical to spiritual existence. And as she contemplated this continuing legacy, she found profound meaning in knowing that her collaboration with Samuel Whitmore had contributed to the eternal human effort to understand the mysteries that surrounded consciousness, survival, and the ultimate nature of reality itself. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world rested in peaceful silence and the boundaries between dimensions became most permeable, Margaret often sensed the presence of benevolent spirits who continued to watch over her work and provide guidance for her ongoing efforts to help others navigate the complex territory where the known and unknown intersected. Awareness that filled her with comfort and confidence as she prepared for whatever mysteries and adventures her remaining years might bring. Secure in the knowledge that love and service created connections that extended far beyond the limitations of physical existence and contributed to the healing and evolution of consciousness throughout all dimensions of reality. The winter of 1992 brought an unusual stillness to the coastal town of Beacon Harbor, Maine, where the Atlantic waves crashed against weathered granite cliffs with a rhythm that had lulled generations of residents to sleep. But this particular season would prove different for those who worked the quiet hours, when most of the community rested safely in their beds, unaware of the strange events that were beginning to unfold in the shadows of their picturesque seaside village that tourists knew only for its charming lighthouse and quaint bed and breakfast establishments. Eleanor Walsh had been the night desk clerk at Beacon Harbor's only 24-hour establishment, Murphy's Corner Market, for 11 years. Ever since her divorce had left her needing steady employment that would accommodate her need to be home during the day with her teenage daughter Sarah. And in all those years of working the midnight to 8 shift, she had developed an intimate knowledge of her small town's nocturnal rhythms. From the predictable arrival of fishermen buying coffee and supplies before their pre-dawn departures to the occasional late-night emergencies that brought worried parents seeking children's medicine or travelers needing directions to the nearest hospital. The familiar patterns of night shift life in a small coastal community had given Eleanor a sense of security and purpose that she had not expected to find in what many people considered an undesirable job assignment. But she had come to appreciate the quiet hours when she could read mystery novels between customers, the peaceful solitude that allowed her to process the changes in her life since her marriage had ended, and the unique perspective that came from observing her community during the vulnerable hours when people's true natures often revealed themselves more clearly than during the busy daylight hours when social conventions and public expectations shaped behavior in more predictable ways. Asterisk. The first indication that something unusual was beginning to occur came on the night of January 7th, when Eleanor noticed a pattern in the movements of a particular customer who had been visiting the store with increasing frequency over the past several weeks, always arriving between 2 and 3 in the morning, always purchasing the same items. A combination of basic supplies and seemingly random objects that created an odd assortment that Eleanor found herself analyzing during the quiet hours when her mind naturally turned to the small mysteries that made night shift work more interesting than most people realized. The customer was a man in his mid-40s named Thomas Bradley. According to the credit card he used for his purchases, someone Eleanor recognized as a newcomer to the area who had rented a cottage on the outskirts of town sometime in late autumn. And while there was nothing obviously suspicious about his behavior, something in his manner and the specific items he purchased created a subtle sense of unease that Eleanor could not easily dismiss, particularly given her years of experience reading the moods and intentions of people who shop during the vulnerable hours when guards were down and true personalities emerged. Asterisk. Thomas Bradley's purchases followed a pattern that became more apparent as Eleanor began keeping informal notes about his visits, documenting not out of any specific concern, but simply because the regularity and precision of his routine struck her as noteworthy in a community where most night shift customers were either dealing with genuine emergencies or making impulse purchases driven by immediate needs rather than careful planning and systematic preparation for some unknown purpose. The items he bought included practical supplies like batteries, flashlights, rope, and plastic sheeting, combined with seemingly innocuous products like children's toys, women's clothing in various sizes, and personal care items that suggested he was shopping for multiple people despite living alone in his remote cottage. According to the local gossip that reached Eleanor through the network of information that flowed through small communities, where everyone eventually learned everyone else's business through the natural process of observation and conversation. Eleanor's growing curiosity about Thomas Bradley's unusual shopping patterns might have remained nothing more than idle speculation if not for the conversation she overheard during his visit on the night of January 21st. When she noticed him speaking quietly on his cell phone while browsing the store's limited selection of children's books, a conversation that contained references to schedules, locations, and timing that suggested coordination with other people for activities that were planned to occur during specific windows of opportunity. The fragments of conversation that Eleanor was able to hear without appearing to eavesdrop included mentions of coastal roads, tide schedules, and something about packages that needed to be collected and transported. Information that by itself might have had innocent explanations, but which, when combined with Thomas Bradley's unusual purchasing patterns and secretive behavior, began to create a picture of activities that extended beyond the normal boundaries of legitimate business or personal affairs. Eleanor's experience working night shifts had taught her to trust her instincts about people in situations that felt wrong, even when she could not articulate specific reasons for her concerns. And her growing unease about Thomas Bradley led her to begin paying closer attention to other unusual activities that she had previously dismissed as normal variations in the community's nocturnal patterns. Observations that gradually revealed connections between seemingly unrelated events that suggested something more complex and potentially troubling was occurring in their peaceful coastal town. The winter storms that regularly battered the Maine coast during January and February provided natural cover for activities that required privacy and discretion, and Eleanor began to notice an increase in unfamiliar vehicles traveling the coastal roads during the early morning hours, when visibility was limited and most residents were asleep. Traffic that seemed to follow patterns related to weather conditions and tide schedules rather than the random movements of lost tourists or residents dealing with emergencies. Her position at the corner market's night desk provided Eleanor with an excellent vantage point for observing traffic patterns along the main coastal road, and she began keeping an informal log of vehicles that passed during her shift, noting license plate numbers when possible and documenting the timing and frequency of movements that seemed to follow predictable schedules. Information that gradually revealed the existence of organized activities that were clearly designed to avoid detection by law enforcement or curious residents. The breakthrough in Eleanor's informal investigation came during the blizzard of February 14th, when most of the town was effectively shut down by heavy snow and high winds that made travel dangerous, except for essential personnel and emergency responders. Conditions that should have eliminated most traffic, but which instead seemed to provide cover for increased activity by the network of people whose movements Eleanor had been monitoring throughout the winter months. During the height of the storm, Eleanor observed a convoy of 3 vehicles that passed the market heading toward the more remote sections of the coast, following the route that Thomas Bradley typically used when leaving the store after his regular shopping visits. And approximately 2 hours later, the same vehicles returned traveling in the opposite direction, timing that suggested they had been involved in activities that required coordination and careful scheduling rather than random travel or emergency response. The vehicles were moving slowly and carefully through the storm conditions, but Eleanor was able to observe that they were carrying additional cargo on their return journey, loads that had not been present when they had passed heading toward the coast, and the careful way the drivers navigated the dangerous roads suggested they were transporting something valuable or fragile that required protection from the harsh weather conditions that were keeping most other travelers safely indoors. Eleanor's curiosity about what was being transported along the coastal roads during the worst weather of the winter led her to begin exploring the remote areas of the coastline during her days off, hiking along the cliff paths and investigating the numerous small coves and inlets that provided natural landing spots for boats willing to risk the dangerous winter conditions. Explorations that gradually revealed evidence of recent activity in locations that were normally deserted during the off-season months, when tourists avoided the harsh coastal weather. The evidence she discovered included tire tracks in areas that should have been inaccessible to vehicles, footprints in sand and mud that indicated multiple people had been present at various coastal locations during recent storms, and most significantly, traces of materials and equipment that suggested organized activities requiring coordination between land-based and maritime operations. Findings that painted a picture of systematic use of the remote coastline for purposes that required secrecy and careful planning. Eleanor's growing understanding of the scope and organization of the mysterious activities occurring along their coastline filled her with concerns about the potential implications for community safety, particularly given the presence of families with children throughout the area and the limited law enforcement resources available in their remote location. But she also recognized that her observations were based on circumstantial evidence that might be difficult to explain to authorities who were not familiar with the subtle patterns she had been documenting over several months of careful observation. The decision to take action, rather than simply continuing to observe, came when Eleanor discovered evidence that suggested the mysterious activities were expanding beyond simple transportation of unknown cargo to include what appeared to be preparation for longer-term operations that would have more significant impact on the local community. Findings that convinced her that the situation had progressed beyond innocent explanations and required intervention by people with the authority and resources to investigate properly. During her exploration of a remote cove that had shown signs of recent activity, Eleanor discovered a cache of supplies that had been concealed among the rocks. Materials that included camping equipment, communication devices, and most disturbing, items that suggested preparations for activities involving multiple people over extended periods of time. Evidence that indicated the winter transportation operations were part of a larger plan that would continue into the spring and summer months, when tourist season would bring many more potential victims to the area. The supplies included detailed maps of the local coastline with specific locations marked in ways that suggested surveillance and planning, documentation that revealed intimate knowledge of local tides, weather patterns, and the daily routines of residents and businesses throughout the area. Information that could only have been gathered through systematic observation and preparation by people who were familiar with law enforcement procedures and the natural patterns that governed life in small coastal communities. Asterisk. Eleanor's discovery of the hidden cache provided the concrete evidence she needed to contact authorities. But her decision about how to proceed was complicated by her realization that the people involved in these activities had demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of local conditions and procedures, suggesting they might have connections to or information about law enforcement activities that could compromise any investigation, if not handled with appropriate discretion and security precautions. The solution to Eleanor's dilemma came through her friendship with Detective Maria Santos, a state police investigator who had grown up in Beacon Harbor before pursuing her law enforcement career and who maintained strong connections to the community while possessing the resources and expertise necessary to handle complex criminal investigations that exceeded the capabilities of local authorities. Someone Eleanor trusted to take her concerns seriously while also protecting her safety during any investigation that might result from her observations. Detective Santos had built her reputation on careful, methodical investigation of complex cases that required patience and attention to detail, qualities that made her particularly effective at unraveling criminal operations that relied on secrecy and misdirection to avoid detection. And her familiarity with coastal communities provided her with insights into how criminal organizations adapted their methods to exploit the unique opportunities and vulnerabilities that existed in remote maritime locations. When Eleanor contacted Detective Santos and described her observations about the unusual activities occurring along their coastline, she found herself speaking to someone who immediately understood the potential significance of the patterns she had documented and who possessed both the investigative experience and the resources necessary to determine whether her concerns were justified and what actions might be appropriate to protect community safety while gathering evidence about criminal activities. Detective Santos' initial review of Eleanor's informal documentation revealed patterns that were consistent with organized smuggling operations, activities that had become increasingly common along the Maine coast as criminal organizations sought to exploit remote locations and harsh weather conditions that provided natural cover for transportation of illegal goods, ranging from drugs and weapons to human trafficking operations that preyed on vulnerable people seeking to enter the country through locations where border security was limited by geography and weather. The timing of the activities that Eleanor had observed, coordinated with storm systems and tide schedules, suggested the involvement of people with maritime experience and detailed knowledge of coastal conditions, capabilities that indicated a level of sophistication and organization that posed significant risks to community safety and required careful investigation, using techniques that would not alert the criminal organization to law enforcement interest until sufficient evidence had been gathered to support arrests and prosecution. Detective Santos explained that Eleanor's position as a night shift worker at the corner market provided an ideal cover for continued observation of the criminal activities, allowing them to gather additional evidence while maintaining the appearance of normal community routines that would not raise suspicions among the people involved in the smuggling operation. And she provided Eleanor with specific guidance about what information to document and how to communicate safely with law enforcement without compromising the investigation. The collaborative investigation that developed between Eleanor and Detective Santos represented a partnership between community, observation, and professional law enforcement that proved essential for understanding the full scope of the criminal operation and identifying all the people involved in activities that had been carefully designed to exploit the natural conditions and social patterns that characterized their remote coastal location during the harsh winter months when outside scrutiny was minimal. Over the following weeks, Eleanor's continued observation of Thomas Bradley and the network of associates whose activity she had been monitoring provided Detective Santos with detailed intelligence about the timing, routes, and methods used by the smuggling operation, information that revealed a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating along the coast for several months and was preparing to expand their activities as weather conditions improved and tourist season approached. The evidence gathered through their collaboration documented a complex operation that involved coordination between land-based and maritime elements, with Thomas Bradley serving as a local coordinator who managed supplies and logistics while other members of the organization handled transportation and distribution of whatever goods were being moved to their remote coastal location, activities that required careful timing and extensive local knowledge to avoid detection by the limited law enforcement resources available in the area. Detective Santos' analysis of the intelligence provided by Eleanor's observations revealed connections to similar criminal activities that had been reported along other sections of the Maine coast, suggesting that the Beacon Harbor operation was part of a larger network that exploited multiple remote locations to distribute illegal goods throughout the region, information that required coordination with federal agencies and other state law enforcement organizations to address effectively. The complexity of the criminal network and its connections to broader smuggling operations meant that any law enforcement action would need to be carefully planned and coordinated to avoid alerting other members of the organization and allowing them to relocate their activities to different locations, challenges that required patience and continued intelligence gathering before any arrests could be made without compromising ongoing investigations of related criminal activities. Eleanor's role in the investigation evolved from informal observer to active intelligence asset as detective. Santos provided her with training in surveillance techniques and communication procedures that would allow her to gather more detailed information about the criminal activities while maintaining her cover as a night shift worker whose observations appeared to be the result of coincidence rather than deliberate investigation. The training included instruction in recognizing and documenting evidence of criminal activity, techniques for safely photographing and recording information without detection, and procedures for communicating with law enforcement in ways that would not compromise the investigation if criminal organizations attempted to monitor law enforcement communications or identify sources of intelligence about their activities. As spring approached and the harsh winter weather that had provided natural cover for the smuggling operations began to moderate, Eleanor and Detective Santos observed changes in the patterns of criminal activity that suggested the organization was preparing to transition to different methods and possibly expand their operations to take advantage of the increased maritime traffic and tourism that characterized the warmer months along the Maine coast. Asterisk, the changes included increased activity by Thomas Bradley and his associates, more frequent meetings between members of the organization, and evidence of preparations for activities that would require different equipment and procedures than the winter operations. Modifications that suggested the criminal network was adapting to changing conditions while maintaining their use of the remote coastal locations that had proven effective for avoiding detection during the harsh weather months. Detective Santos explained that the transition period between winter and spring operations often provided the best opportunities for law enforcement action, as criminal organizations were most vulnerable when they were adapting their methods and procedures, but that any intervention would need to be timed carefully to gather maximum intelligence about the broader network while ensuring the safety of community members who might be affected by law enforcement actions. The decision about when and how to take action was complicated by evidence suggesting that the criminal organization had been monitoring law enforcement communications and activities, information that indicated they possessed sophisticated counter-surveillance capabilities and connections that could provide advance warning of any planned law enforcement operations, challenges that required innovative approaches to investigation and arrest procedures. Eleanor's continued observations during the transition period provided Detective Santos with crucial intelligence about the organization's counter-surveillance methods and their procedures for detecting and responding to law enforcement interest. Information that proved essential for planning operations that could succeed, despite the criminal network's security precautions and their knowledge of standard law enforcement procedures. The breakthrough that enabled law enforcement action came when Eleanor observed a meeting between Thomas Bradley and several previously unknown members of the criminal organization, a gathering that included discussion of plans for expanded operations and specific mention of activities that would pose direct threats to community safety, information that provided Detective Santos with the justification and intelligence necessary to coordinate arrests and seizure operations. Asterisk, the meeting occurred during a late March storm that provided natural cover for the criminal gathering, but Eleanor's careful documentation of the participants and their discussion revealed plans for activities that included not only continued smuggling operations but also recruitment of local residents and expansion into other illegal activities that would have significant impact on community safety and the welfare of families throughout the area. Detective Santos used Eleanor's intelligence to coordinate a multi-agency operation that included state police, federal agencies, and specialized units trained in maritime law enforcement, resources that were necessary to address the complexity and geographic scope of the criminal network while ensuring that all members of the organization were arrested simultaneously to prevent warning of associates and destruction of evidence. Asterisk, the coordinated arrests took place during the early morning hours of April 15th, when most members of the criminal organization were present at locations that Eleanor and Detective Santos had identified through months of careful observation. An intelligence gathering, operations that successfully apprehended Thomas Bradley and 12 other people involved in activities that included smuggling, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit additional crimes that would have affected communities throughout the region. The evidence seized during the arrests included detailed documentation of smuggling operations, communication equipment used to coordinate activities along the coast, and materials that revealed connections to criminal organizations in other states and countries, findings that supported Eleanor's initial observations about the scope and sophistication of the activities that had been occurring in their peaceful coastal community. The successful conclusion of the investigation provided validation for Eleanor's decision to trust her instincts about unusual activities and to take action rather than simply dismissing her concerns as imagination or coincidence. Recognition that her careful observation and willingness to cooperate with law enforcement had prevented crimes that could have had serious consequences for community safety and individual victims who might have been affected by the criminal organization's planned expansion of their activities. Detective Santos credited Eleanor's contribution as essential to the success of the investigation, noting that community members who were willing to observe and report suspicious activities provided law enforcement with capabilities that could not be replicated through traditional investigative methods, particularly in remote locations where criminal organizations attempted to exploit isolation and limited law enforcement resources to avoid detection. The trial of Thomas Bradley and his associates revealed the full scope of their criminal activities, including evidence that they had been responsible for smuggling operations along multiple sections of the Maine coast and had connections to international criminal organizations involved in trafficking drugs, weapons, and people. information that demonstrated the significance of Eleanor's observations and the importance of community vigilance in detecting and preventing criminal activities. Eleanor's experience as a key witness in the criminal prosecution provided her with insights into the legal system and the process by which community observations were transformed into evidence that could support criminal convictions. Knowledge that enhanced her understanding of the important role that ordinary citizens could play in maintaining community safety through cooperation with law enforcement agencies. The recognition that Eleanor received for her contribution to the investigation included commendations from state and federal law enforcement agencies, but more importantly for her personal satisfaction. She gained the knowledge that her willingness to trust her instincts and take action had protected her community and prevented crimes that could have affected many innocent people. Accomplishment that provided meaning and purpose that enhanced her satisfaction with her night shift work. The changes in Beacon Harbor following the arrests and prosecution of the criminal organization included increased cooperation between residents and law enforcement, as community members became more aware of the importance of reporting suspicious activities and more confident that their observations would be taken seriously by authorities who possess the resources and expertise necessary to investigate complex criminal operations. Eleanor's role as a liaison between the community and law enforcement agencies continued long after the conclusion of the smuggling investigation, as her experience and knowledge made her a valuable resource for identifying and addressing other potential threats to community safety, responsibilities that provided her with ongoing purpose and satisfaction beyond her regular duties as a night shift clerk. The quiet hours of Eleanor's work shifts returned to their normal patterns after the disruption of the investigation and arrests, but her heightened awareness of community activities and her enhanced understanding of criminal methods continued to make her an effective observer of the subtle changes in behavior and circumstances that might indicate new threats to community safety. Capabilities that provided lasting value for law enforcement agencies and community members. Detective Santos continued to work with Eleanor and other community members to develop networks of observation and communication that could provide early warning of criminal activities, programs that built on the success of their collaboration during the smuggling investigation and created ongoing capabilities for detecting and preventing crimes that might otherwise go unnoticed until they had caused significant harm to individuals and communities. The seasonal rhythms of coastal life in Maine continued their eternal cycles, bringing tourists during the summer months and the familiar challenges of winter weather, but the community's enhanced awareness and preparedness provided protection against criminal organizations that might attempt to exploit their remote location and limited law enforcement resources. Security that had been purchased through Eleanor's courage and Detective Santos' expertise. As Eleanor settled into the later years of her night shift career, she found satisfaction in knowing that her work involved more than simply serving customers and managing inventory, but also included contributing to community safety through vigilant observation and willingness to cooperate with law enforcement agencies when suspicious activities required investigation. Purpose that elevated her understanding of her role and provided meaning that extended beyond the immediate requirements of her employment. The friendship that had developed between Eleanor and Detective Santos continued to provide both women with personal satisfaction and professional resources that enhanced their capabilities for protecting community safety. A partnership that demonstrated the value of cooperation between community members and law enforcement agencies in addressing complex criminal activities that required both local knowledge and professional expertise to detect and prevent. The story of Eleanor Walsh and her role in uncovering the coastal smuggling operation became part of the local history that was shared with new residents and discussed at community meetings as an example of how ordinary citizens could contribute to community safety through awareness and cooperation with law enforcement, recognition that encouraged other residents to remain alert to unusual activities, and confident that their concerns would receive appropriate attention from authorities. The night shift hours at Murphy's Corner Market continued to provide Eleanor with opportunities for quiet reflection and observation of community activities. But her experience with the smuggling investigation had enhanced her appreciation for the important role that such positions could play in maintaining community safety. Understanding that transformed her perception of night shift work from a necessary job to a valuable service that contributed to the welfare of everyone who lived in their peaceful coastal town. The memories of the investigation and its successful conclusion provided Eleanor with stories that she shared with her daughter, Sarah, and other family members as examples of how individuals could make significant differences in their communities. Through courage, persistence, and willingness to trust their instincts when circumstances suggested that action was necessary to protect others from potential harm. Lessons that emphasize the importance of civic responsibility and community cooperation. Detective Santa's career continued to benefit from the investigative techniques and community relationships she had developed during the Beacon Harbor smuggling case, methods that proved applicable to other complex criminal investigations throughout the state and provided her with expertise that was valued by colleagues and supervisors, who recognized her ability to build effective partnerships with community members and develop intelligence through patient observation and analysis. The remote coastal locations that had been exploited by the criminal organization returned to their natural state as places of beauty and tranquility, where residents and visitors could enjoy the magnificent scenery and peaceful atmosphere that characterized the Maine coast, but the knowledge that such locations could also be vulnerable to criminal exploitation provided ongoing motivation for continued vigilance and cooperation between community members and law enforcement agencies. As the seasons continued their eternal cycle and new challenges emerged in the ongoing effort to maintain community safety and security, the lessons learned from Eleanor Walsh's courage and Detective Santos' expertise continued to provide guidance and inspiration for other individuals who found themselves in positions where their observations and actions could contribute to the protection of innocent people and the prevention of criminal activities that threatened community welfare and individual safety. The quiet hours of night shift work in small communities throughout coastal Maine continued to provide opportunities for vigilant residents to observe and report suspicious activities, capabilities that had been enhanced by the success of the Beacon Harbor investigation and the recognition that ordinary citizens possessed unique advantages for detecting criminal activities that might otherwise escape the attention of law enforcement agencies with limited resources and geographic coverage. The peaceful atmosphere that characterized Beacon Harbor during the early morning hours when Eleanor worked her shifts had been restored after the disruption of the criminal investigation, but the community's enhanced awareness and preparedness ensured that such tranquility was protected by vigilant observation and effective cooperation with law enforcement agencies. Security that provided residents with confidence that their safety and welfare remained priorities for both community members and professional authorities charged with maintaining law and order. Eleanor's continuing work as a night shift clerk provided her with ongoing opportunities to observe community activities and maintain the network of awareness that had proven so valuable during the smuggling investigation. Responsibilities that she approached with enhanced understanding of their importance and satisfaction in knowing that her willingness to remain alert and take appropriate action when necessary contributed to the safety and security that allowed other residents to sleep peacefully in their beds while she kept watch during the vulnerable hours of darkness when criminals often attempted to exploit the reduced vigilance that characterized most communities. During the night shift hours when most people rested safely in their homes, the autumn of 1995 brought an unusual sense of anticipation to the basement archives of Riverside University Library. Located in the heart of Illinois farmland where golden cornfields stretched endlessly beneath vast skies that seemed to hold all the stories and secrets of generations, who had lived and worked the fertile soil that sustained both the rural communities and the academic institution that served as a center of learning and research for students and scholars from around the world, who came seeking knowledge and understanding in the peaceful environment that fostered deep thinking and careful study. Catherine Martinez had worked as the university's head archivist for 8 years, ever since completing her master's degree in library science with a specialization in historical preservation. And during those years, she had developed an intimate relationship with the countless documents, photographs, personal papers, and institutional records that filled the climate-controlled storage rooms beneath the main library building. Materials that represented the accumulated memory of the university and the surrounding agricultural communities whose stories had been carefully preserved for future generations of researchers and students. The archives contained everything from the university's founding documents and early faculty correspondence to detailed records of scientific research conducted over the decades. But Catherine's particular expertise and passion lay in the collection of local history materials that documented the lives and experiences of ordinary people who had lived in the region since the earliest days of European settlement. Stories that often revealed fascinating insights into how individuals and communities had adapted to changing circumstances and overcome challenges that tested their resilience and determination. Catherine's work involved not only maintaining and organizing the existing collections, but also actively seeking out new materials that would enhance the archive's ability to serve researchers and preserve important historical information. Activities that had led her to develop relationships with families throughout the region who trusted her with their most precious documents and photographs, understanding that her careful stewardship would ensure these materials would be available for future generations, while also being used to advance scholarly understanding of regional history and culture. The discovery that would transform Catherine's understanding of her role and lead her into an investigation that challenged her assumptions about the nature of historical truth began on the morning of October 3rd, when she was processing a recent donation from the estate of Harold Kessler, a retired farmer whose family had operated the same land for more than a century and whose personal papers promised to provide valuable insights into the evolution of agricultural practices and rural community life in the region during the 20th century. Harold Kessler's papers included the expected collection of farm records, family correspondence, and community organization documents that typically characterize such donations. But as Catherine worked through the carefully labeled boxes, she discovered a manila envelope marked with Harold's handwriting that contained materials unlike anything she had previously encountered in her years of archival work. Documents that immediately captured her attention and suggested connections to events and people that did not fit the established narratives of local history that she had spent years helping to document and preserve. The envelope contained a collection of newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photographs that appeared to document Harold's investigation into a series of mysterious disappearances that had occurred in the area during the 1950s. Events that had never been widely reported or officially resolved, but which Harold had apparently researched with the systematic thoroughness that he had applied to all aspects of his farming operation, creating a detailed record of information that revealed patterns and connections that had not been recognized by law enforcement or community officials at the time. The newspaper clippings came from various regional publications and covered a period of approximately 3 years, from 1952 to 1955, during which at least 7 people had vanished under circumstances that shared troubling similarities, despite occurring in different communities and involving individuals who appeared to have no connections to each other. Patterns that Harold had identified through careful analysis and documentation that demonstrated investigative skills that Catherine would not have expected from a farmer whose formal education had ended with high school graduation. Asterisk. Harold's handwritten notes revealed his methodical approach to analyzing the disappearances, including detailed timelines, maps showing the locations where people had last been seen, and careful documentation of witness accounts and official responses to the missing person reports. Information that painted a picture of law enforcement agencies that were either unwilling or unable to recognize the connections between cases that occurred across jurisdictional boundaries and involved victims whose social status and circumstances may have contributed to the limited attention their disappearances received from authorities. The photographs in Harold's collection were perhaps the most intriguing element of his investigation, including images that appeared to have been taken covertly at various locations throughout the region. Pictures that showed individuals and activities that seemed somehow connected to the patterns of disappearances that Harold had been documenting. Though the exact nature of these connections was not immediately apparent from the visual evidence alone and would require additional investigation to understand their significance in the broader context of Harold's research. Catherine's initial reaction to Harold Kessler's materials was professional curiosity, combined with personal fascination about the investigative work that this quiet farmer had conducted without any official authorization or academic training. But as she spent more time examining the documents and considering their implications, she began to recognize that she might have discovered evidence of historical events that had been overlooked or suppressed, information that could contribute to a more complete understanding of regional history, while also potentially providing answers to questions that had remained unresolved for more than 40 years. The decision to pursue her own investigation into Harold Kessler's research was influenced by Catherine's growing recognition that the materials in his collection represented more than simply one individual's amateur detective work, but instead documented systematic patterns of criminal activity that had apparently occurred without adequate investigation or resolution by the authorities, who should have been responsible for protecting community safety and ensuring that justice was served when crimes were committed against vulnerable members of society. Asterisk. Catherine's approach to investigating Harold's materials combined her professional skills in historical research with techniques borrowed from investigative journalism and criminal analysis, methods that allowed her to verify information, identify additional sources, and build upon Harold's foundation work while maintaining the scholarly standards that were essential for producing credible research that could contribute to academic understanding and potentially support any legal proceedings that might result from her discoveries. The first phase of Catherine's investigation involved locating and examining official records related to the disappearances that Harold had documented, a process that required visits to various county courthouses, police departments, and newspaper archives throughout the region. Research that gradually revealed the extent to which these cases had received minimal attention from authorities and limited coverage from local media, circumstances that suggested either incompetence or deliberate suppression of information that should have prompted more thorough investigation and public attention. The official records that Catherine was able to locate painted a disturbing picture of missing person cases that had been processed through routine administrative procedures without the intensive investigation that the suspicious circumstances should have warranted. Reports that contained minimal detail about the victims' backgrounds, the circumstances of their disappearances, or the efforts made by law enforcement to locate them and determine what had happened. Documentation that suggested a systematic failure to provide adequate protection for vulnerable members of rural communities. Catherine's examination of newspaper coverage from the period revealed additional evidence of inadequate attention to the disappearances, with most cases receiving only brief mentions in local publications and no follow-up reporting to keep public attention focused on the unresolved cases. Coverage patterns that were particularly troubling when compared to the extensive attention given to other local news events during the same period, suggesting that editorial decisions may have contributed to the lack of public awareness and pressure for thorough investigation of the missing person cases. The breakthrough in Catherine's investigation came when she discovered that several of the missing Individuals had been connected, directly or indirectly, to a traveling agricultural equipment sales operation that had been active in the region during the period when the disappearances occurred. A business that had employed seasonal workers and maintained temporary facilities in various communities, creating opportunities for systematic targeting of vulnerable individuals, while also providing cover for criminal activities through the natural mobility and temporary presence that characterized such operations. The Agricultural Equipment Company, which had operated under the name Midwest Farm Solutions, had maintained detailed employment and customer records that had been preserved in various business archives and government offices. Documentation that provided Catherine with information about the company's operations, personnel, and locations during the relevant time period. Materials that revealed patterns of movement and activity that correlated closely with the timing and geographic distribution of the mysterious disappearances that Harold Kessler had investigated. Catherine's analysis of the Midwest Farm Solutions records revealed that the company had employed a number of individuals with criminal backgrounds, including several people who had been convicted of violent crimes in other states, before joining the company's traveling sales operation. Information that had apparently not been discovered or considered by local authorities when the disappearances were first reported, suggesting failures in background investigation and information sharing that may have enabled criminal activity to continue undetected. The most significant discovery in Catherine's investigation was her identification of a particular individual named Robert Sinclair, who had been employed by Midwest Farm Solutions as a regional sales supervisor during the entire period when the disappearances occurred, and whose work territory had included all the communities where people had vanished, creating a clear pattern of opportunity and access that made him the most likely suspect for involvement in criminal activities that could explain the missing person cases that had puzzled Harold Kessler and local authorities. Robert Sinclair's employment records with Midwest Farm Solutions revealed a pattern of behavior that included frequent disciplinary actions, complaints from customers and co-workers about inappropriate conduct, and several incidents that had required intervention by company management. Information that painted a picture of an individual whose behavior had raised concerns among people who worked with him, but whose problems had been addressed through internal company procedures rather than law enforcement investigation that might have revealed criminal activity. Catherine's research into Robert Sinclair's background revealed a disturbing history of criminal activity in other states, including arrests for assault, fraud, and harassment that had resulted in criminal convictions and periods of incarceration, but also showed that this information had not been effectively shared between jurisdictions or made available to employers, who might have been able to prevent him from gaining access to vulnerable potential victims through his work with the traveling agricultural sales operation. The pattern of Robert Sinclair's movements during his employment with Midwest Farm Solutions correlated almost perfectly with the timing and locations of the disappearances that Harold Kessler had documented, creating circumstantial evidence that strongly suggested his involvement in criminal activities that had gone undetected because of inadequate investigation by local law enforcement agencies and poor communication between jurisdictions that allowed dangerous individuals to move freely between communities without appropriate monitoring or supervision. Catherine's investigation had progressed to the point where she possessed substantial evidence suggesting that the mysterious disappearances of the 1950s had been the work of a serial criminal who had exploited his legitimate employment to identify and target vulnerable victims while using his mobility and temporary presence in various communities to avoid detection. But she also recognized that the passage of more than 40 years had created challenges for any legal proceeding that might result from her discoveries, particularly given the likelihood that key witnesses and evidence had been lost to time. The decision about how to proceed with her findings required Catherine to consider both the historical significance of her discoveries and the potential for providing some measure of closure to families who had spent decades wondering about the fate of their missing loved ones, while also acknowledging the limitations imposed by the passage of time and the deaths of many people who might have been able to provide crucial testimony or evidence if the investigation had been conducted when the crimes were fresh and witnesses were available. Catherine's consultation with university colleagues who specialized in criminal justice and legal history provided her with guidance about how to present her findings in ways that would contribute to academic understanding while also potentially supporting any law enforcement investigation that might still be possible despite the passage of time. Approaches that would ensure her research met scholarly standards, while also maximizing its potential value for providing answers to questions that had remained unresolved for more than 4 decades. The process of documenting and presenting Catherine's findings required careful attention to ethical considerations about the privacy and dignity of victims and their families, while also ensuring that information was presented in ways that would support rather than hinder any ongoing or future investigation that might be conducted by law enforcement agencies with jurisdiction over the cases, responsibilities that reflected the complex intersection between academic research and criminal investigation that characterized her unique situation. Catherine's preliminary presentation of her findings to university administrators and faculty colleagues generated significant interest and support for continued research, but also raised questions about the institution's responsibilities when academic research revealed evidence of possible criminal activity, issues that required consultation with legal experts and law enforcement officials to ensure that appropriate procedures were followed and that the university's actions supported rather than compromised any investigation that might result from the discoveries. The involvement of law enforcement in Catherine's research came through her contact with Detective Lieutenant James Morrison of the Illinois State Police, an experienced investigator who specialized in cold cases and had developed expertise in analyzing historical evidence and coordinating investigations that crossed jurisdictional boundaries, qualifications that made him ideally suited to evaluate Catherine's findings and determine what actions might be appropriate given the unique circumstances of her discoveries. Detective Morrison's review of Catherine's research materials confirmed that she had identified substantial evidence suggesting systematic criminal activity that had not been adequately investigated at the time it occurred. And he explained that while the passage of time had created significant challenges for criminal prosecution, there remained possibilities for investigation that might provide answers to families and contribute to law enforcement understanding of historical cases that shared characteristics with more recent unsolved crimes. The collaboration that developed between Catherine and Detective Morrison represented a partnership between academic research and law enforcement investigation that combined scholarly methods with police procedures to address questions that required both historical analysis and criminal investigation expertise, an approach that proved essential for making progress on cases that had remained unsolved because they had not been recognized as connected crimes when they originally occurred. Detective Morrison's investigation confirmed that Robert Sinclair had died in 1978 while serving a prison sentence for unrelated crimes in another state. Information that eliminated the possibility of criminal prosecution, but also supported Catherine's conclusion that he had been responsible for the disappearances, while also revealing that his criminal career had continued after his time with Midwest Farm Solutions and had eventually resulted in convictions that might have been prevented if his earlier activities had been properly investigated. The investigation conducted by Detective Morrison also revealed that several other individuals who had been employed by Midwest Farm Solutions during the relevant period had later been convicted of serious crimes in various states. Information that suggested the company may have served as a recruitment or coordination mechanism for criminal activity, either through deliberate policy or through failure to conduct adequate background investigations of employees who were given Access to vulnerable potential victims. Catherine's continued research into the broader context of the disappearances revealed connections to similar patterns of missing person cases that had occurred in other regions where traveling agricultural sales operations had been active during the same period, suggesting that the crimes Harold Kessler had investigated may have been part of a larger network of criminal activity that had exploited the mobility and temporary presence that characterized such businesses to avoid detection and accountability. For systematic victimization of vulnerable individuals, the findings from Catherine's investigation were eventually published in academic journals that specialized in criminal justice history and cold case analysis, contributing to scholarly understanding of how criminal activity could be disguised within legitimate business operations and how failures in communication and investigation could allow systematic crimes to continue undetected, information that provided valuable insights for contemporary law enforcement agencies dealing with similar challenges. The families of the missing individuals who had been identified through Catherine's research received notification about the investigations findings through carefully coordinated contacts that were designed to provide information and closure while also respecting their privacy and emotional needs. Communications that were handled with sensitivity and support that acknowledged the pain and uncertainty they had endured for so many years without answers about their loved ones' fates. Catherine's experience conducting her investigation into Harold Kessler's materials had transformed her understanding of the role that archivists and historical researchers could play in uncovering and addressing injustices that had been overlooked or suppressed. Recognition that influenced her subsequent work and led her to develop programs that would help other researchers identify and investigate historical evidence of criminal activity that might still require attention from law enforcement or provide closure to affected families. The methods and approaches that Catherine had developed during her investigation became part of the training that she provided to other archivists and researchers who encountered materials that suggested criminal activity or systematic injustices that had not been adequately addressed by authorities. Educational programs that helped ensure that important evidence would be recognized and appropriately handled when it was discovered in historical collections and personal papers. Detective Morrison's work on the case contributed to improvements in cold case investigation procedures and interjurisdictional communication that helped prevent similar failures in contemporary criminal investigations, while also providing law enforcement agencies with better understanding of how historical cases could be analyzed and resolved even when traditional investigative approaches were no longer feasible due to the passage of time. The recognition that Catherine received for her contribution to resolving the historical disappearances included awards from professional archival organizations and law enforcement agencies. But more importantly, for her personal satisfaction, she gained the knowledge that her scholarly work had provided answers and closure to families who had spent decades wondering about the fate of their missing loved ones, accomplishment that demonstrated the potential for academic research to address real-world problems and contribute to justice and healing. The university's archives developed enhanced procedures for identifying and handling materials that might contain evidence of criminal activity, guidelines that ensured such discoveries would be appropriately investigated while also maintaining the scholarly standards and ethical principles that governed academic research, improvements that benefited both the institution and the broader community by ensuring that important evidence would not be overlooked or mishandled when it was uncovered through routine archival work. Catherine's ongoing research into regional history continued to reveal connections between past and present that provided insights into how communities had dealt with challenges and changes over time. But her experience investigating the mysterious disappearances had enhanced her awareness of the importance of looking beyond official narratives and established stories to discover truths that might have been overlooked, suppressed, or forgotten. Perspective that enriched all her subsequent scholarly work. The collaboration between academic Researchers and law enforcement agencies that had been pioneered through Catherine's work with Detective Morrison became a model for similar partnerships in other locations. Programs that recognized the value of combining scholarly research methods with police investigative techniques to address complex cases that required both historical analysis and criminal investigation expertise, approaches that proved beneficial for resolving cold cases and advancing understanding of criminal activity patterns. Harold Kessler's original investigation into the mysterious disappearances was recognized posthumously as an example of citizen involvement in criminal investigation that had provided crucial foundation work for the eventual resolution of cases that might otherwise have remained permanently unsolved. Recognition that honored his dedication to seeking truth and justice. Despite lacking official authority or professional training in investigative techniques, the seasonal rhythms of university life continued their familiar patterns of academic years and research cycles. But Catherine's experience investigating the historical disappearances had provided her with enhanced understanding of the potential for archival work to contribute to justice and community healing, awareness that influenced her approach to all aspects of her professional responsibilities and personal commitment to preserving and sharing historical knowledge that could benefit contemporary society. The basement archives of Riverside University Library returned to their usual quiet atmosphere after the excitement and attention generated by Catherine's investigation. But the enhanced procedures and awareness that resulted from her discoveries continued to influence how historical materials were processed and analyzed, improvements that ensured future researchers would be better equipped to recognize and appropriately handle evidence of criminal activity or social injustices that might be uncovered through scholarly research. As Catherine settled into the later years of her career as head archivist, she found satisfaction in knowing that her work involved more than simply preserving documents and serving researchers, but also included the potential for uncovering truths that could provide answers to unresolved questions and contribute to justice for victims whose suffering had been overlooked or forgotten. Purpose that elevated her understanding of her profession and provided meaning that extended beyond the traditional boundaries of academic library work. The friendship that had developed between Catherine and Detective Morrison continued to provide both professionals with resources and perspectives that enhanced their capabilities for addressing complex cases that required both historical research and criminal investigation expertise. A partnership that demonstrated the value of collaboration between academic and law enforcement professionals in pursuing truth and justice through patient analysis and systematic investigation. The story of Catherine Martinez and her role in uncovering the truth about the mysterious disappearances of the 1950s became part of the university's institutional history and was shared with students and faculty as an example of how scholarly research could contribute to addressing real-world problems and providing closure to families and communities affected by unresolved crimes. Recognition that encouraged other researchers to remain alert to the potential significance of materials they encountered in their academic work. The quiet hours that Catherine spent working alone in the archives continued to provide her with opportunities for careful analysis and deep thinking about the historical materials in her care. But her experience investigating Harold Kessler's research had enhanced her appreciation for the detective work that was often required to understand the full significance of documents and artifacts that preserved the stories of ordinary people whose lives had been affected by extraordinary circumstances. The memories of her investigation and its successful resolution provided Catherine with stories that she shared with colleagues and students as examples of how attention to detail, systematic analysis, and willingness to pursue difficult questions could lead to discoveries that advanced both academic understanding and social justice. Lessons that emphasize the importance of scholarly integrity and the potential for research to contribute to healing and closure for individuals and communities affected by historical injustices. Detective Morrison's career continued to benefit from the investigative techniques and research methods he had learned during his collaboration with Catherine, approaches that proved valuable for analyzing other cold cases and developing new strategies for addressing crimes that had remained unsolved due to jurisdictional limitations, inadequate initial investigation, or the passage of time that had created challenges for traditional investigative methods. The agricultural communities surrounding Riverside University continued their eternal cycles of planting and harvest. But the knowledge that their peaceful rural environment had once been exploited by criminals who preyed on vulnerable residents provided ongoing motivation for continued vigilance and cooperation between community members and law enforcement. Agencies that were better equipped to recognize and investigate patterns of criminal activity that might otherwise escape detection. As the seasons continued their familiar progression and new challenges emerged in the ongoing effort to preserve historical knowledge and ensure community safety. The lessons learned from Catherine Martinez's courage and Detective Morrison's expertise continued to provide guidance and inspiration for other individuals who found themselves in positions where their professional skills and personal dedication could contribute to the discovery of truth and the achievement of justice for victims whose suffering had been overlooked by previous generations of officials and researchers who lacked the tools, knowledge, or commitment necessary to address complex cases that required patience, skill, and determination to resolve. The spring of 1998 brought an unusual abundance of flowering plants to the residential neighborhoods of Cedar Valley, Colorado, where the mountain air carried the sweet fragrance of lilac and apple blossoms through tree-lined streets that had been carefully planned to create a sense of small-town charm in what had originally been developed as a bedroom community for professionals who commuted to the larger cities in the valley below, seeking the tranquility and natural beauty that had drawn settlers to this particular corner of the Rocky Mountains for more than a century. Rose Shun had been the night supervisor at Mercy General Hospital for 6 years, ever since her family had relocated from California to escape the stress and expense of urban life and find a place where their 2 young children could grow up surrounded by the kind of community connections and natural environment that seemed increasingly rare in the modern world. And her position overseeing the hospital's night shift operations had provided her with both stable employment and an intimate knowledge of how their small mountain community functioned during the quiet hours when most residents slept peacefully in their beds. Mercy General was a modest facility that served the medical needs of Cedar Valley and several surrounding rural communities, providing emergency services, basic surgical procedures, and the kind of personalized care that had become difficult to find in larger metropolitan hospitals, where patients often felt like numbers rather than individuals with unique needs and circumstances. And Rose's responsibilities included coordinating with emergency responders, managing patient admissions, and ensuring that the skeleton crew of doctors and nurses who worked the night shift had everything they needed to provide quality care during the hours when staffing was minimal but medical. Emergencies continued to occur with unpredictable frequency, the first indication that something unusual was beginning to happen in their peaceful community came during Rose's shift on the night of April 22nd, when the emergency department received an unusual number of calls about people who had been found unconscious in their gardens or yard areas. Individuals who were discovered by family members or neighbors during the early morning hours lying among flower beds or vegetable gardens, with no memory of how they had gotten there or what had caused them to lose consciousness in outdoor locations, where they had no reason to be during the middle of the night. The patients who were brought to the hospital during that first night all shared similar symptoms and circumstances that created a puzzling pattern for the medical staff who examined them, including complete amnesia about the hours immediately preceding their discovery. Mild disorientation gradually cleared as they regained full consciousness, and traces of soil and plant matter on their clothing and hands that suggested they had been working in gardens or handling plants during the time period they could not remember. Activities that seemed inconsistent with their normal nocturnal routines and personal interests. Dr. Michael Harrison, the attending physician who examined the first several patients brought in with these mysterious symptoms, initially suspected some form of food poisoning or environmental contamination that might have affected multiple people in the same neighborhood. But blood tests and other medical examinations failed to reveal any toxins, diseases, or physical injuries that could explain the temporary loss of consciousness and memory, results that ruled out most common medical explanations, while raising new questions about what could cause such specific and unusual symptoms in otherwise healthy individuals. Rose's professional experience with emergency medical situations had taught her to pay attention to patterns and connections that might not be immediately obvious to individual doctors or nurses who were focused on treating specific patients. And her position coordinating patient admissions provided her with a unique perspective on the broader picture that was emerging as more people were brought to the hospital with similar symptoms and circumstances, information that suggested they were dealing with something more complex than isolated medical emergencies. The pattern of patients continued throughout the following weeks, with 1 to 3 individuals being brought to the hospital each night with the same mysterious combination of symptoms and circumstances, always found unconscious in outdoor garden areas, always with complete amnesia about how they had gotten there, and always showing evidence of recent contact with soil and plants despite having no conscious memory of engaging in gardening activities during the nighttime, hours when normal people would be asleep in their beds. Rose's careful documentation of the cases revealed additional patterns that were not immediately apparent to the medical staff who treated individual patients, including the fact that all the affected individuals lived in the same general area of Cedar Valley, a neighborhood of newer homes where many residents had invested considerable time and money in creating elaborate gardens and landscaped yards that had become a source of community pride and friendly competition among neighbors who shared a passion for horticulture and outdoor beautification. The geographic concentration of the cases in the Gardens District, as the affected neighborhood was known locally, suggested that whatever was causing the mysterious episodes was connected to something specific about that area. Possibly environmental factors related to the elaborate landscaping that characterized the community, or social factors that brought residents into contact with influences that were not present in other parts of Cedar Valley where similar symptoms had not been reported. Dr. Harrison's consultation with toxicology experts and neurologists from larger medical centers failed to provide satisfactory explanations for the symptoms and circumstances affecting the Gardens District residents, but their analysis did rule out most known toxins, diseases, and neurological conditions that could cause temporary amnesia and loss of consciousness, results that narrowed the range of possible explanations while also highlighting the unusual nature of the phenomena they were attempting to understand. Rose's investigation into the medical mystery was influenced by her background in nursing research and her natural curiosity about patterns and connections that might reveal important information about patient care and community health. Approaches that led her to begin conducting informal interviews with the affected individuals and their families to gather information that might not be captured in standard medical examinations and treatment records. The interviews that Rose conducted with patients and their families during their recovery periods revealed additional details about the circumstances surrounding the mysterious episodes, including reports from family members who had noticed that the affected individuals had shown unusual interest in gardening activities during the days preceding their episodes, spending more time than normal working in their yards and expressing newfound enthusiasm for plants and landscaping projects that had not previously been priorities for them. Several family members reported that their affected relatives had mentioned vivid dreams about gardens and plants during the period leading up to their mysterious episodes. Dreams that had been unusually detailed and memorable compared to their normal sleep experiences, and some had awakened with specific ideas about garden improvements or plant selections that seemed to come from sources of knowledge they could not readily identify or explain through their previous experience or interests. The pattern of increased gardening interest preceding the episodes suggested that whatever was affecting the garden's district residents was influencing their behavior and thoughts before the dramatic incidents that brought them to medical attention. Changes that had been subtle enough to seem like normal variations in personal interests, but which, in retrospect, appeared to be part of a progressive influence that culminated in the mysterious nighttime episodes that left them unconscious in their gardens. Rose's analysis of the timing patterns associated with the episodes revealed that they occurred most frequently during specific lunar phases and weather conditions that created optimal growing conditions for plants. Correlations that suggested possible connections to natural cycles and environmental factors that might be influencing both plant growth and human behavior in ways that were not immediately obvious to medical professionals who were focused on treating symptoms rather than investigating underlying causes. The breakthrough in Rose's investigation came when she discovered that all the affected residents had recently purchased plants or gardening supplies from the same source. A new nursery called Mountain Blooms that had opened in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Cedar Valley during the previous autumn, operated by a man named David Fletcher, who had moved to the area from somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and who had quickly developed a reputation for providing unusual varieties of plants and expert advice about gardening techniques that produced remarkable results. Mountain Blooms occupied a large warehouse space that had been extensively modified to create optimal growing conditions for a wide variety of plants, including many species that were not typically available in the region, and some varieties that David Fletcher claimed to have developed through his own breeding and cultivation experiments, work that he described as combining traditional horticultural knowledge with innovative techniques that he had learned during years of study and experimentation in various locations throughout the country. Rose's visit to Mountain Blooms, ostensibly to purchase plants for her own garden, but actually to observe David Fletcher and his operation, revealed a facility that was impressive in its scope and sophistication, containing growing areas that were carefully controlled for temperature, humidity, and lighting conditions, along with extensive collections of seeds, bulbs, and plant materials that represented species from around the world, resources that suggested far more extensive knowledge and financial investment than would typically be associated with a small-town nursery operation. David Fletcher himself was a man in his early 50s with an intense but friendly manner who demonstrated encyclopedic knowledge about plants and growing conditions, answering Rose's questions with detailed explanations that revealed his expertise, while also suggesting that his interests extended beyond simple commercial horticulture to research, areas that involve studying the effects of various plants on human health and behavior. Topics that he discussed with enthusiasm that seemed genuine, but which also raised questions about the nature and purpose of his experiments. During their conversation, David Fletcher mentioned his particular interest in plants that had been used historically for medicinal and spiritual purposes by indigenous cultures, species that he claimed to be studying for their potential applications in modern therapeutic settings, research that he described as combining traditional knowledge with contemporary scientific methods to develop new understanding of how plants could be used to promote healing and enhance human well-being through carefully controlled application of natural compounds and essences. Rose's professional background in nursing had provided her with sufficient knowledge of pharmacology and plant-based medicine to recognize that David Fletcher was describing research areas that could have legitimate therapeutic applications, but which could also be misused to manipulate human behavior or consciousness in ways that might not be in the best interests of the people who were exposed to such influences. Possibilities that added a new dimension to her concerns about the mysterious episodes affecting Gardens District residents. The connection between the affected residents, plant purchases from Mountain Blooms, and their subsequent mysterious episodes seemed too significant to be coincidental. But Rose also recognized that establishing definitive cause and effect relationships would require more systematic investigation than she could conduct alone, particularly given the potential legal and medical implications if David Fletcher was using his nursery operation to expose customers to substances that could affect their consciousness or behavior without their knowledge or consent. Rose's decision to contact law enforcement about her concerns was influenced by her professional obligations as a healthcare worker to report suspected criminal activity that might be affecting patient safety. But she was also motivated by her personal responsibility as a community member to protect neighbors and friends from potential harm. Even when the evidence available to her was circumstantial and the suspected crimes involved methods that were unusual and difficult to prove through standard investigative procedures. Detective Captain Sarah Mitchell of the Cedar Valley Police Department was an experienced investigator who had dealt with cases involving drugs and other substances that could affect human consciousness and behavior. But Rose's description of the mysterious episodes affecting Gardens District residents presented challenges that were unlike anything she had previously encountered in her law enforcement career. Circumstances that required consultation with medical and scientific experts to develop appropriate investigative strategies. Detective Mitchell's initial investigation confirmed that all the affected residents had indeed purchased plants from Mountain Blooms during the weeks preceding their mysterious episodes. But it also revealed that David Fletcher had been careful to maintain detailed records of his sales and customer interactions, documentation that appeared to support his claims that he was operating a legitimate nursery business focused on providing quality plants and gardening advice to customers who shared his enthusiasm for horticulture and natural landscaping. The challenge for law enforcement was determining whether David Fletcher was deliberately using his nursery operation to expose customers to substances that could affect their consciousness and behavior, or whether the mysterious episodes were the result of accidental exposure to natural compounds that were present in the plants he sold. Possibilities that required different investigative approaches and had very different legal implications for any criminal charges that might be appropriate. Detective Mitchell's consultation with botanical experts and toxicologists revealed that many plants contain natural compounds that could affect human consciousness and behavior when properly processed and administered, but that such effects typically required deliberate preparation and specific methods of exposure that would not occur through normal gardening activities. Information that suggested the mysterious episodes might involve more than accidental contact with naturally occurring plant substances. Asterisk. The investigation's focus shifted to examining David Fletcher's background and qualifications, research that revealed a history of involvement with research institutions and pharmaceutical companies that had been studying plant-based compounds for various applications, but also showed gaps in his employment history and educational credentials that raised questions about his training and the sources of his extensive knowledge about plants and their effects on human physiology and psychology. Rose's continued observation of patients who were brought to the hospital with symptoms related to the mysterious episodes provided Detective Mitchell with additional evidence about the progression and characteristics of the condition affecting Gardens District residents. Information that helped medical experts develop a better understanding of what substances might be involved and how they were being administered to produce the specific combination of symptoms and circumstances that characterized each case. Medical analysis revealed that the affected individuals were being exposed to a combination of natural compounds that created temporary alterations in consciousness and memory formation. Substances that were administered in ways that bypassed normal taste and smell detection, while creating effects that were designed to enhance suggestibility and compliance. methods that suggested sophisticated knowledge of pharmacology and human psychology that exceeded what would typically be expected from someone operating a simple nursery business. The discovery that the mysterious episodes involved a deliberate administration of consciousness-altering substances transformed the investigation from a medical mystery into a criminal case involving systematic drugging of community members without their knowledge or consent. Activities that violated numerous laws and posed serious risks to public safety, particularly given the vulnerability of people who were being affected during nighttime hours when they were isolated and unable to seek help or protection. Detective Mitchell's expanded investigation revealed that David Fletcher had been using his nursery operation as cover for systematic experimentation on unwitting subjects. Research that involved testing various combinations of plant-based compounds to study their effects on human behavior and memory. Activities that constituted serious criminal violations of informed consent principles and medical ethics while also posing significant risks to the health and safety of community members who had trusted him as a legitimate business owner. The evidence gathered through the investigation included sophisticated laboratory equipment that David Fletcher had concealed in areas of his warehouse facility that were not accessible to customers, materials that were being used to process plants and create concentrated substances that could be administered through various methods including absorption through skin contact, inhalation of processed plant materials, and contamination of gardening tools and supplies that customers would handle during normal horticultural activities. David Fletcher's arrest on charges including assault, administering drugs without consent, and conducting illegal human experimentation brought an end to the mysterious episodes that had been affecting Gardens District residents. But the investigation also revealed that his activities had been part of a broader pattern of criminal research that had been conducted in other communities, suggesting that law enforcement agencies in multiple states might need to investigate similar cases involving victims who had been exposed to experimental substances without their knowledge or consent. The trial of David Fletcher revealed the full scope of his criminal activities, including evidence that he had been collecting detailed data about the effects of various plant-based compounds on human subjects, research that he had been conducting without any authorization from medical or academic institutions, and without any of the safety protections that were required for legitimate scientific research involving human participants. Activities that had placed numerous innocent people at risk while violating fundamental principles of medical ethics and informed consent. The victims of David Fletcher's experiments received medical monitoring and psychological support to address any long-term effects of their exposure to consciousness-altering substances. Care that was coordinated between Mercy General Hospital and specialists from larger medical centers who had experience treating patients who had been affected by experimental drugs or toxins. Treatment that helped ensure their recovery while also contributing to medical understanding of the substances and methods that had been used in the illegal experiments. Rose's role in uncovering and investigating David Fletcher's criminal activities received recognition from both medical and law enforcement professionals who acknowledged that her careful observation and systematic documentation had been essential for identifying patterns that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Contributions that demonstrated the important role that healthcare workers could play in detecting and preventing crimes that targeted vulnerable community members through methods that exploited trust in legitimate business relationships. Enhanced security procedures that were implemented at Mercy General Hospital following the investigation included improved protocols for recognizing and reporting suspicious patterns in patient admissions and symptoms. Training that helped ensure that healthcare workers would be better equipped to identify potential criminal activity that might be disguised as medical emergencies or natural illness. Capabilities that provided ongoing protection for patients and community members. Detective Mitchell's work on the case contributed to improvements in interagency communication and investigation procedures that helped law enforcement agencies recognize and address criminal activities involving experimental substances and unauthorized human research. Developments that benefited communities throughout the region by providing better protection against individuals who might attempt to exploit legitimate business operations to conduct illegal experiments or administer harmful substances to unwitting victims. The Gardens district of Cedar Valley recovered from the disruption and fear that had accompanied the mysterious episodes and subsequent investigation, with residents gradually returning to their normal gardening activities while maintaining enhanced awareness of the importance of purchasing plants and supplies from reputable sources that could be trusted to provide safe products and honest information about their effects and proper use. Knowledge that helped protect them from similar exploitation in the future. The seasonal cycles of mountain life continued their familiar patterns of snow and sunshine, planting and harvest, but the community's enhanced awareness and preparedness provided protection against individuals who might attempt to exploit their trust and enthusiasm for gardening and natural living to conduct unauthorized experiments or administer harmful substances. Security that had been purchased through Rose's vigilance and Detective Mitchell's expertise in investigating complex criminal activities. Rose's experience during the investigation had provided her with enhanced understanding of the connections between medical symptoms and potential criminal activity, awareness that influenced her subsequent work and made her a more effective advocate for patient safety and community health, while also demonstrating the potential for healthcare workers to contribute to law enforcement efforts through careful observation and systematic documentation of suspicious patterns and circumstances. The friendship that had developed between Rose and Detective Mitchell continued to provide both women with professional resources and personal support that enhanced their capabilities for protecting community safety and addressing complex cases that required cooperation between medical and law enforcement professionals. Partnership that served as a model for collaboration between different types of public service professionals who shared commitment to protecting vulnerable community members. The story of Rose Shun and her role in uncovering David Fletcher's illegal experimentation became part of the local history that was shared with new residents and discussed at community meetings as an example of how healthcare workers and other professionals could contribute to community safety through awareness and willingness to report suspicious activities to appropriate authorities. Recognition that encouraged other community members to remain alert and take action when circumstances suggested potential threats to public safety. The night shift hours at Mercy General Hospital continued to provide Rose with opportunities for quiet reflection and careful observation of community health patterns. But her experience investigating the mysterious episodes had enhanced her appreciation for the detective work that was often required to understand the full significance of medical symptoms and patient circumstances that might indicate broader threats to community safety and individual welfare. Asterisk. The memories of the investigation and its successful resolution provided Rose with stories that she shared with colleagues and family members as examples of how attention to detail, professional expertise, and willingness to pursue difficult questions could lead to discoveries that protected innocent people and prevented serious harm. Lessons that emphasize the importance of professional responsibility and the potential for individual action to contribute to community safety and justice. Detective Mitchell's career continued to benefit from the investigative techniques and medical knowledge she had gained during her collaboration with Rose, approaches that proved valuable for analyzing other cases involving substances that affected human consciousness and behavior, while also providing her with enhanced understanding of how legitimate businesses could be exploited to disguise criminal activities that required specialized knowledge to detect and investigate effectively. The mountain communities surrounding Cedar Valley continued their seasonal rhythms of tourism and outdoor recreation, but the knowledge that their peaceful environment could be exploited by criminals who used legitimate business operations to conduct. Illegal experiments provided ongoing motivation for continued vigilance and cooperation between community members. And law enforcement, agencies that were better equipped to recognize and investigate unusual criminal methods. Asterisk, as the seasons progressed and new challenges emerged in the ongoing effort to maintain community safety and ensure that healthcare systems could effectively protect patients from both natural diseases and criminal activities that might disguise themselves as medical problems. The lessons learned from Rose Chun's courage and Detective Mitchell's expertise continued to provide guidance and inspiration for other professionals who found themselves in positions where their skills and dedication could contribute to protecting innocent people from harm. The quiet hours of night shift work in small mountain communities throughout Colorado continued to provide opportunities for vigilant healthcare workers to observe and report suspicious patterns that might indicate criminal activity or threats to public safety. Capabilities that had been enhanced by the success of the Cedar Valley investigation and the recognition that medical professionals possessed unique advantages for detecting crimes that exploited the trust and vulnerability that characterized healthcare relationships and community interactions. The peaceful atmosphere that characterized Cedar Valley during the early morning hours when Rose worked her shifts had been restored after the disruption of the criminal investigation. But the community's enhanced awareness and preparedness ensured that such tranquility was protected by vigilant observation and effective cooperation with law enforcement agencies. Security that provided residents with confidence that their safety and welfare remained priorities for both community members and professional authorities. Eleanor's continuing work as a night shift supervisor provided her with ongoing opportunities to observe community health patterns and maintain the network of awareness that had proven so valuable during the illegal experimentation investigation. Responsibilities that she approached with enhanced understanding of their importance and satisfaction in knowing that her willingness to remain alert and take appropriate action when necessary contributed to the safety and security that allowed other residents to sleep peacefully while she kept watch during the vulnerable hours of darkness. The botanical evidence that had been collected during the investigation provided researchers with new understanding of how plant-based compounds could be processed and administered to affect human consciousness and behavior. Knowledge that contributed to both legitimate medical research and law enforcement understanding of methods that could be used by criminals to exploit vulnerable victims. Information that enhanced protection capabilities while also advancing scientific knowledge about the intersection between botany and human psychology. The enhanced communication between healthcare facilities and law enforcement agencies that had been established during the Cedar Valley investigation created ongoing capabilities for detecting and addressing criminal activities that might attempt to exploit medical systems or use healthcare facilities to disguise illegal experiments or substance administration. Improvements that benefited communities throughout the region by providing better protection against individuals who might attempt to use legitimate institutions to conduct unauthorized research or harm innocent people. As Rose approached the middle years of her healthcare career, she found herself increasingly interested in the connections between community health and safety that her investigation had revealed. Pursuing additional training in toxicology and criminal investigation techniques that would enhance her ability to recognize and address threats that might manifest through unusual medical symptoms or patient circumstances. Preparation that would allow her to continue contributing to community protection throughout her remaining years of professional service. The Gardens District of Cedar Valley returned to its natural role as a showcase of horticultural beauty and community cooperation, with residents resuming their passion for gardening and landscaping, while maintaining the enhanced awareness and caution that would protect them from similar exploitation in the future. Knowledge that had been purchased through their experience as unwitting subjects in David Fletcher's illegal experiments, but which now provided them with wisdom that would prevent similar Victimization. The seasonal cycles of mountain gardening continued their eternal rhythms of preparation, planting, growth, and harvest. But the community's enhanced understanding of the potential for criminal exploitation of legitimate gardening activities provided ongoing protection against individuals who might attempt to use horticultural interests to disguise illegal activities or gain access to vulnerable people who could be manipulated through substances that affected their consciousness and behavior. Catherine's role as an advocate for patient safety and community health continued long after the conclusion of the illegal experimentation case, as her experience and knowledge made her a valuable resource for identifying and addressing other potential threats that might manifest through unusual medical symptoms or patterns of illness that could indicate criminal activity. Responsibilities that provided her with ongoing purpose and satisfaction beyond her regular duties as a night shift supervisor. The network of communication and cooperation that had developed between healthcare workers and law enforcement agencies during the investigation continued to provide ongoing capabilities for detecting and preventing criminal activities that might attempt to exploit medical systems or community trust. Partnerships that demonstrated the value of collaboration between different types of professionals who shared commitment to protecting public safety and individual welfare. The recognition that Rose received for her contribution to uncovering and stopping David Fletcher's illegal experimentation included awards from medical and law enforcement organizations. But more importantly, for her personal satisfaction, she gained the knowledge that her professional vigilance and willingness to investigate unusual patterns had protected her community and prevented crimes that could have caused serious harm to innocent people who had trusted a criminal to provide legitimate gardening products and advice. The story of the Gardens District investigation became part of the training materials used by healthcare and law enforcement professionals throughout Colorado and other states where similar criminal methods might be attempted. Educational resources that helped ensure that the lessons learned from Rose's experience would contribute to protecting other communities from individuals who might attempt to exploit horticultural interests and healthcare systems to conduct illegal experiments or administer harmful substances to unwitting victims. The basement archives where Catherine had made her historical discoveries and the coastal roads where Eleanor had observed suspicious activities represented different types of locations where ordinary people could contribute to uncovering criminal activity through careful observation and systematic investigation. But Rose's experience in the healthcare setting demonstrated that medical facilities and symptoms patterns could also provide crucial information about crimes that might otherwise go undetected until they had affected many more victims and caused much greater harm to individuals and communities. The winter of 2001 brought an unusual serenity to the historic downtown district of Millfield, Wisconsin, where the Carnegie Library had stood as a monument to learning and community service for nearly a century. Its red brick facade and tall arched windows creating a sense of permanence and dignity that had weathered countless seasons of change while continuing to serve as a sanctuary for knowledge seekers and a gathering place for residents who valued the quiet contemplation and intellectual exploration that had always characterized this beloved institution in their small Midwestern town. Rebecca Foster had been the library's night security coordinator for 4 years, a position created after budget constraints had eliminated round-the-clock staffing. But community concerns about protecting the valuable collections and historic building had prompted the implementation of overnight security measures that included both electronic monitoring systems and human presence during the vulnerable hours, when the library was closed to the public but remained a repository of irreplaceable books, documents, and cultural artifacts that represented the accumulated wisdom and memory of their community. Rebecca's responsibilities included conducting regular patrols of the building's 3 floors and basement storage areas, monitoring the patrols of the building's 3 floors and basement storage areas, monitoring the various security systems that protected the collections from theft and environmental damage, and maintaining the climate control systems that preserved delicate materials while ensuring that the historic structure remained stable and secure throughout the harsh Wisconsin winters when temperature fluctuations and moisture changes could threaten both the building and its contents. If not carefully managed through constant vigilance and professional expertise, the position had appealed to Rebecca because it combined her love of books and learning with her preference for working during the quiet hours when she could pursue her own research interests between security rounds, using the library's extensive collections to support her ongoing studies in local history and genealogy that had become a passionate avocation since her retirement from a career in education, providing her with intellectual stimulation and purpose that enhanced her satisfaction with the security work while also contributing to her understanding of the community she was helping to protect. The first indication that something unusual was occurring in the library came during Rebecca's patrol on the night of December 15th, when she discovered that several books in the local history section had been removed from their proper locations and arranged on reading tables in patterns that seemed deliberate rather than random, configurations that suggested someone had been conducting research using specific materials related to the founding families of Millfield and the circumstances surrounding the establishment of the community during the late 19th century. The displaced books included rare volumes of family histories, early township records, and collections of personal papers that had been donated to the library by descendants of the original settlers, materials that were normally restricted to supervised research use because of their age and fragility, and their arrangement on the reading tables suggested that someone had been conducting systematic research into particular aspects of local history that required access to multiple sources and careful cross-referencing of information from different time periods and perspectives. Rebecca's discovery of the unauthorized research activity raised immediate concerns about security breaches and potential damage to irreplaceable historical materials. But her examination of the books and documents revealed no signs of vandalism or theft, instead showing evidence of careful handling and respectful treatment that suggested the mysterious researcher possessed both knowledge of proper archival procedures and genuine interest in preserving the materials. While conducting their investigation into whatever questions had prompted their nocturnal visit to the restricted collections, the security systems that monitored the library's entrances and protected areas had not detected any unauthorized entry during the night when the books had been displaced. A finding that suggested either sophisticated knowledge of the building's security measures or access through means that had not been anticipated when the protection systems were designed and installed. Possibilities that raised questions about who might possess such detailed knowledge of the library's operations and security procedures. Rebecca's investigation into the security breach began with a careful review of all the monitoring systems and access logs that recorded movement throughout the building. Analysis that revealed no evidence of forced entry or tampering with locks, windows, or other potential entry points, but which did show some unusual patterns in the electronic systems that suggested someone with technical knowledge had been able to manipulate the security equipment without triggering the alarms that should have alerted her to unauthorized presence in the building. The pattern of books that had been selected for the mysterious research session provided clues about the focus and purpose of the unauthorized investigation, with materials relating to 3 specific founding families who had played prominent roles in establishing Millfield during the 1870s and 1880s, particularly documents that dealt with land transactions, business partnerships, and legal disputes that had occurred during the community's early development. Topics that suggested the mysterious researcher was investigating historical events that had shaped the town's development in ways that might not be widely known or understood. Rebecca's own knowledge of local history, gained through years of personal research and her work with the library's collections, provided her with sufficient background to recognize that the materials selected by the mysterious researcher dealt with aspects of Millfield's founding that had been sources of controversy and conflict, including allegations of fraud and corruption that had been largely forgotten by contemporary residents, but which had been documented in private papers and legal records that were preserved in the library's special collections. The specific focus on documents relating to the Wheeler, Morrison, and Blackwood families suggested that the mysterious researcher was investigating connections between these founding families and events that had occurred during Millfield's establishment, relationships that had been characterized by business partnerships that had dissolved amid accusations of betrayal and financial misconduct, disputes that had been resolved through legal proceedings that had favored some parties, while leaving others with substantial losses and grievances that had influenced community dynamics for generations. Rebecca's decision to investigate further, rather than simply securing the displaced materials and increasing security measures, was influenced by her recognition that the mysterious researcher had demonstrated both respect for the historical materials and genuine scholarly interest in understanding important aspects of local history, behavior that suggested educational or research purposes rather than criminal intent. Though the unauthorized access to restricted collections remained a serious security concern that required investigation and resolution, the investigation took an unexpected turn when Rebecca discovered additional evidence of the mysterious researcher's activities during her patrol on the night of December 22nd. Finding that someone had been using the library's microfilm readers to examine old newspaper archives, focusing specifically on issues from the 1880s that contained reports about legal proceedings and business disputes involving the same founding families whose papers had been displaced during the previous unauthorized research session. Activities that demonstrated systematic investigation into historical events that had shaped community development. The microfilm that had been accessed included newspaper coverage of a particular legal case from 1884 that had involved accusations of land fraud and document forgery against prominent community leaders. Allegations that had been vigorously disputed and eventually dismissed, but which had generated significant controversy and division within the community that had taken years to resolve. Events that had been largely forgotten by contemporary residents but which were documented in detail in the newspaper archives that the mysterious researcher had been examining. Rebecca's review of the newspaper, COVERAG, he revealed that the 1884 legal case had involved claims that forged documents had been used to establish title to large portions of land that had become the foundation for Millfield's development. Accusations that had threatened to invalidate property ownership throughout the community and had been resolved through legal proceedings that had satisfied some parties while leaving others convinced that justice had not been served and that important evidence had been suppressed or destroyed. The historical significance of these events and their potential impact on contemporary property ownership and community relationships provided a possible explanation for why someone might be conducting unauthorized research into these particular aspects of local history, particularly if they believed that evidence had been preserved in the library's collections that could support claims or reveal truths that had been concealed during the original legal proceedings more than a century earlier. Rebecca's growing understanding of the historical context surrounding the mysterious research activities led her to begin her own investigation into the founding families and the legal disputes that had shaped Millfield's early development. Research that revealed complex relationships and unresolved questions that had influenced community dynamics in ways that continued to affect contemporary residents. many of whom were descendants of the original families and parties to the 19th century. Conflicts, asterisk. The deeper Rebecca delved into the historical records, the more she began to understand why someone might be motivated to conduct unauthorized research into these particular events, as the documentation revealed evidence suggesting that the original legal proceedings had indeed involved suppression of evidence and manipulation of testimony that had favored certain parties while denying justice to others. Circumstances that had created lasting grievances and questions about the legitimacy of property titles and business relationships that had shaped the community's development. Catherine's investigation also revealed that several prominent contemporary families in Millfield were direct descendants of the individuals who had been involved in the 1884 legal disputes, and that property ownership and business relationships throughout the community continued to reflect the advantages and disadvantages that had been established through those controversial proceedings, suggesting that resolution of the historical injustices could have significant implications for current residents and their financial interests. The realization that the mysterious research activities might be connected to contemporary legal or financial interests rather than simple historical curiosity added new dimensions to Rebecca's investigation and raised questions about whether the unauthorized access to restricted collections was part of a larger effort to gather evidence that could support legal challenges to property ownership or business arrangements that had been established through the disputed 19th century proceedings. Rebecca's decision to contact law enforcement about the security breaches was influenced by her recognition that the stakes involved in the mysterious research might extend beyond simple unauthorized use of library materials to include potential fraud, property disputes, or other legal matters that could affect numerous community members and require professional investigation to protect both individual rights and community stability, issues that exceeded her authority and expertise as a library security coordinator. Detective Robert Hayes of the Millfield Police Department was an experienced investigator who had dealt with various types of property crimes and civil disputes. But Rebecca's description of the sophisticated unauthorized access to historical materials and the potential connections to contemporary legal and financial interests presented challenges that required consultation with experts in both criminal investigation and civil law to determine appropriate responses that would protect community interests while ensuring that any legitimate research purposes were not unnecessarily restricted. Detective Hayes' initial investigation confirmed that the library's security systems had been circumvented through methods that required technical knowledge and careful planning, evidence that suggested the unauthorized researcher possessed skills and resources that exceeded what would typically be associated with casual interest in local history, capabilities that indicated possible professional or commercial motivations for the research activities rather than simple academic curiosity about community heritage. The investigation's focus expanded to include analysis of who might have the motivation and resources to conduct such sophisticated research into Millfield's founding families and historical property disputes. Inquiry that revealed several ongoing legal and business situations that could potentially benefit from evidence that might be found in the library's historical collections, circumstances that provided possible explanations for the unauthorized research while also highlighting the need to protect the collections from exploitation for commercial or legal purposes. Hayes' consultation with legal experts revealed that evidence found in historical documents could potentially be used to challenge property titles and business arrangements that had been established during the 19th century, particularly if such evidence demonstrated fraud or other illegal activities that had not been properly addressed by the original legal proceedings, possibilities that explained why someone might be willing to take significant risks to access restricted historical materials without authorization. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Rebecca's enhanced security monitoring detected the mysterious researcher during their next visit to the library. Surveillance that revealed the individual to be Martin Blackwood, a direct descendant of one of the founding families whose ancestors had been disadvantaged by the 1884 legal proceedings, and whose contemporary financial difficulties had apparently motivated him to search for historical evidence that might support legal challenges to property, arrangements that had been established through the disputed court decisions. Martin Blackwood's unauthorized research had been motivated by his discovery that his family had been deprived of substantial property holdings through legal proceedings that had involved suppression of evidence and manipulation of testimony, circumstances that had left his ancestors in poverty while enriching other families who had benefited from the fraudulent activities. And his investigation into the library's historical collections was part of an effort to gather evidence that might support contemporary legal action to recover compensation for these historical injustices. The evidence that Martin had been seeking was indeed present in the library's collections, contained in private papers and correspondence that documented the fraudulent activities and conspiracy that had characterized the 1884 legal proceedings, materials that had been donated to the library by families who had apparently been unaware of their significance or potential implications for contemporary property ownership and legal relationships. Information that had remained hidden in the archives until Martin's unauthorized research had revealed its existence and importance. Detective Hayes' investigation confirmed that Martin Blackwood had been conducting his research without criminal intent, motivated by legitimate grievances about historical injustices that had affected his family for generations. But his methods of accessing restricted materials had violated library policies and potentially criminal laws regarding unauthorized entry and use of protected collections, circumstances that required careful consideration of appropriate responses that would address the security violations while also acknowledging the legitimacy of his historical grievances. The resolution of Martin Blackwood's unauthorized research activities involved negotiations between his legal representatives, library administration, and community leaders that resulted in authorized access to the historical materials he had been seeking, along with establishment of proper procedures for investigating and potentially addressing the historical injustices that his research had revealed. Arrangements that protected both the library's collections and Martin's legitimate interests in pursuing redress for documented wrongs. The legal proceedings that resulted from Martin's research revealed substantial evidence of fraud and conspiracy in the 1884 property disputes, documentation that supported his family's claims and led to settlements with contemporary property owners whose titles had been based on the fraudulent proceedings, resolution that provided Martin with financial compensation while also ensuring that historical truths were acknowledged and preserved for future generations who might encounter similar situations. Rebecca's role in uncovering and helping to resolve Martin Blackwood's situation received recognition from both library and legal professionals who acknowledged that her careful investigation and balanced approach had protected institutional interests while also supporting legitimate research that had revealed important historical truths and led to appropriate resolution of long-standing injustices. Contributions that demonstrated the potential for library professionals to serve broader community interests through vigilant protection of collections and thoughtful response to complex situations. The enhanced security procedures that were implemented at the Carnegie Library following the investigation included improved access controls for restricted materials and better communication with law enforcement agencies, but also established policies for assisting researchers who had legitimate interests in accessing historical materials for legal or scholarly purposes, improvements that provided better protection for collections while also ensuring that the library could continue to serve its educational and research mission effectively. Detective Hayes' work on the case contributed to improved understanding of how historical injustices could affect contemporary legal and property relationships, knowledge that proved valuable for addressing other situations where past crimes or fraudulent activities had created ongoing problems for individuals and communities. Expertise that enhanced his capabilities for investigating complex cases that required analysis of both historical evidence and current circumstances. Asterisk. The Carnegie Library returned to its normal, quiet atmosphere after the disruption and attention generated by the investigation. But the enhanced awareness and procedures that resulted from Rebecca's discoveries continued to influence how historical materials were protected and accessed, improvements that ensured future researchers would have appropriate opportunities to examine important documents while maintaining the security and preservation standards that protected irreplaceable collections from damage or misuse. As Rebecca settled into the later years of her career as night security coordinator, she found satisfaction in knowing that her work involved more than simply protecting books and building, but also included the potential for uncovering truths and supporting justice through careful attention to unusual activities and willingness to investigate circumstances that might reveal important information about community history and contemporary issues. Purpose that elevated her understanding of her profession and provided meaning that extended beyond traditional library security. Responsibilities. The friendship that had developed between Rebecca and Detective Hayes continued to provide both professionals with resources and perspectives that enhanced their capabilities for addressing complex cases that required both historical research and criminal investigation expertise. Partnership that demonstrated the value of collaboration between different types of public service professionals who shared commitment to protecting community interests and ensuring that important truths were discovered and preserved. The story of Rebecca Foster and her role in uncovering Martin Blackwood's research into historical injustices became part of the library's institutional history and was shared with staff and patrons as an example of how library professionals could contribute to community service and justice through vigilant protection of collections and thoughtful response to complex situations that required balancing security concerns with legitimate research needs. Recognition that encouraged other library workers to remain alert to the broader implications of their professional responsibilities. The quiet hours that Rebecca spent patrolling the library's halls and monitoring its collections continued to provide her with opportunities for contemplation and careful observation of the subtle changes and patterns that might indicate unusual activities or potential threats to the materials in her care. But her experience investigating Martin Blackwood's unauthorized research had enhanced her appreciation for the detective work that was often required to understand the full significance of events and circumstances that affected library operations and community interests. The memories of the investigation and its resolution provided Rebecca with stories that she shared with colleagues and community members as examples of how professional expertise, careful analysis, and willingness to pursue complex questions could lead to discoveries that advanced both institutional interests and social justice, lessons that emphasize the importance of balancing security responsibilities with service to legitimate research needs and community welfare. The seasonal rhythms of small-town library life continued their familiar patterns of busy periods during the school year and quieter times during summer months and holidays. But Rebecca's enhanced understanding of the potential connections between historical research and contemporary legal issues provided her with ongoing awareness of how her security work could contribute to broader community interests through careful attention to unusual activities and appropriate response to circumstances that might require investigation or special handling. The Carnegie Library's role as a repository of community memory and knowledge continued to attract researchers and students who valued access to historical materials that were not available elsewhere. But the enhanced security and access procedures that had been developed following Rebecca's investigation ensured that such research could be conducted safely and appropriately, while maintaining protection for irreplaceable collections and compliance with legal and ethical standards that govern the use of historical documents for contemporary purposes. as winter deepened and the library settled into the peaceful rhythms that characterized the coldest months when outdoor activities were limited, and residents spent more time reading and pursuing indoor interests. Rebecca found herself reflecting on the ways that libraries served as bridges between past and present, preserving knowledge and stories that continued to influence contemporary life, while also providing resources for individuals who needed access to historical information for purposes that ranged from academic research to personal family history to legal proceedings that required documentation of past events and relationships. The night shift hours at the Carnegie Library provided Rebecca with unique opportunities to observe and appreciate the institution's role in preserving and sharing knowledge. But her experience investigating the unauthorized research incident had enhanced her understanding of how library collections could become involved in complex legal and social issues that required careful handling and professional expertise to address appropriately while maintaining the institution's commitment to serving legitimate research needs and supporting community welfare. The basement storage areas where much of the library's historical collections were housed returned to their normal quiet state after the attention and activity generated by Martin Blackwood's research and the subsequent investigation. But the enhanced security and monitoring procedures ensured that future access to restricted materials would be properly supervised while also maintaining the availability of important historical resources for researchers who had legitimate scholarly or legal needs for examining such documents. Rebecca's continuing work as night security coordinator provided her with ongoing opportunities to contribute to the library's mission of preserving and sharing knowledge, while also protecting valuable collections from damage, theft, or misuse, responsibilities that she approached with enhanced understanding of their importance and appreciation for the potential connections between historical preservation and contemporary community interests that could emerge through careful attention to unusual activities and circumstances. The recognition that Rebecca received for her handling of the unauthorized research incident included acknowledgement from library administrators, law enforcement officials, and legal professionals who praised her balanced approach to addressing security concerns while also supporting legitimate research interests, contributions that demonstrated the important role that library professionals could play in serving broader community needs through vigilant protection of collections and thoughtful response to complex situations that required expertise in both library science and security procedures. The friendship between Rebecca and Martin Blackwood that had developed during the resolution of his unauthorized research activities continued to provide both individuals with resources for understanding and addressing the historical injustices that had affected their community. Collaboration that demonstrated how initial conflicts could be transformed into productive partnerships when approached with mutual respect and commitment to discovering truth and achieving appropriate resolution of legitimate grievances. Enhanced communication between the Carnegie Library and local law enforcement agencies that had been established during the investigation continued to provide ongoing capabilities for addressing security concerns and protecting collections while also ensuring that library resources could be appropriately used to support legitimate law enforcement and legal proceedings that required access to historical documentation. Improvements that benefited both the institution and the broader community. As Rebecca approached the final years of her career in library security, she found herself increasingly interested in the connections between historical preservation and contemporary justice that her investigation had revealed. Pursuing additional training in archival security and legal research that would enhance her ability to protect collections while also supporting appropriate use of historical materials for purposes that contributed to community welfare and individual rights. Preparation that would allow her to continue serving library and community interests throughout her remaining years of professional service. The Carnegie Library continued to serve as a center of learning and community gathering where residents could access information and pursue research interests in an environment that fostered quiet, contemplation, and intellectual exploration. But the enhanced security and access procedures that had been developed following Rebecca's investigation ensured that valuable collections remained protected while continuing to be available for legitimate research purposes that contributed to education, scholarship, and community understanding. The story of the unauthorized research incident and its resolution became part of the training materials used by library professionals throughout Wisconsin and other states where similar situations might arise. Educational resources that helped ensure that the lessons learned from Rebecca's experience would contribute to protecting other institutions and communities from security breaches while also supporting appropriate access to historical materials for legitimate research purposes that served educational and legal needs. The quiet hours of night security work in libraries throughout the region continued to provide opportunities for vigilant professionals to observe and protect valuable collections, while also remaining alert to unusual activities that might indicate attempts to exploit institutional resources for inappropriate purposes. Capabilities that had been enhanced by the success of Rebecca's investigation and the recognition that library security involved more than simply protecting materials from theft and damage.